Peter Merton's Private Mint by Lee Archer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Quartertone. Peter Merton's Private Mint by Lee Archer. Peter Merton sat at his desk after the district attorney's men left and put his head in his hands. He was still sitting that way when Miss Irene Simmons came in. "Here's the rest of the morning's mail, Mr. Merton," she said. Merton didn't even look up. He was a young, good-looking man in his late 20s, the type known as a rising young executive, possibly because that's exactly what he was. But he did not look young this morning. His interview with the DA had added years to his appearance. He felt old and haggard. "Just put them on the desk," he said. His voice sounded tired. She put the letters on the desk, but when she didn't leave immediately, Peter Merton looked up. Irene Simmons was an average-sized girl with golden brown hair, large blue eyes, a full red mouth, and a lush figure. She looked as though she ought to be working as a bathing suit model instead of as the private secretary to a vice president of Crabbley and Company. "Does it look pretty bad, Mr. Merton?" she asked. "It looks horrible," he said bleakly. "The DA said that since Quiggs has had 4 days to get away, the money is probably in South America by now." He put his hand over his eyes. "If only I hadn't been such a fool. Why did I put the money in my office safe instead of the company vault? $50,000! The insurance company won't pay because the policy says that cash has to be kept in the vault. But how was I to know that Quiggs would come sneaking in here during Christmas vacation and take it out of my safe? He's been working for the company for years. Who would have thought it?" "Frankly, Mr. Merton, I think he was jealous because you were made a vice president instead of him," Irene said firmly. "I think he wanted to ruin you." "Well, he certainly has," Peter said sadly. "Old man Crabbley says that putting the money in my safe was criminal negligence. He says he wants me to pay it back or he'll see that I'm blackballed by every company in the business after he fires me." I'm very sorry, Mr. Merton. I'm sure you'll think of something. The police may catch him after all." "Thank you, Miss Simmons. I hope so," Peter said, but his voice didn't hold much hope. As the girl left the room, Peter absently watched the swaying of her hips as she walked, but he was too upset to appreciate the view fully. He had a serious problem to consider. He thought over what she had said. So Quiggs had been jealous, eh? That probably explains the fact that he had left a $5 bill in the safe. With his odd sense of humor, Quiggs had probably thought it very funny to leave a 5 note in place of the 50,000 he had taken. There was no doubt that it was Quiggs. The police were certain of the guilty person. Quiggs had been seen coming into the office on the Thursday night before Christmas vacation and had left only half an hour later. He had evidently taken the money out and replaced it with a bundle of wrapped paper. Some hours later, he had checked out of his apartment, and all trace of him had been lost. Peter looked up at the Watteau print, which concealed the heavy steel door of the wall safe. $5 lay behind it, all that was left of 50,000. He got up, walked over to the safe, twisted the combination, and pulled the door open. He reached in and took out the bill and looked at it, and looked again with wide eyes, because it wasn't a $5 bill at all. It was a thin sheet of paper like plastic, folded up to about the same size as a banknote. Puzzled, Peter looked into the safe again. Nothing. He thrust his hand in and felt around. Still nothing. Except for the sheet of stuff he held in his hand, the safe was as empty as a church on Monday. Unfolding the folded sheet, Peter saw that it was covered with print. The characters were oddly shaped, and the phraseology was queer, but it was unmistakably English. Peter Merton sat on the edge of his desk and began to read. "Honorable Mr., Miss, or Mrs., to whoever you are in the 20th century, we of the 30th century send greetings. We hope this epistle will be understandable. Our knowledge of the language of English is maybe not as good as might be. Our studies of your time are somewhat hampered by lack of records, and it for this reason is that we contact you. In order for the time transfer field to work, it must be entirely surrounded by thick metal. Also, a piece of similar material must be in place so that transfer can be effected in accordance with the Woolrich equations. If you wish to cooperate in this history-seeking venture, please place a note to such effect in your metal box. Roland Guelph, Terrestrial Bureau of Historical Investigation. Peter frowned and read the thing again. Who would write such silliness? Could it be another joke by Quiggs? No, it couldn't be. He, Peter Merton, had put that $5 bill back into the safe, and he hadn't left the room while it was in there. He looked up at the open safe. It was still empty. Well, by golly, he'd see whether this was a hoax or not. He pulled his gold-plated desk pen out of its crystal holder, took out a piece of office stationery, and wrote, Dear Mr. Guelph, I'm very much interested in your proposition, but I would like to have you explain a little bit more about it. Very truly yours, Peter Merton. He folded it and put it in the safe. Then he sat down and watched it. He watched it for 15 minutes before he decided that nothing was going to happen. Finally, he walked over and took out the paper. It was the same as it had been when he put it in. He looked back at the plastic sheet. Aha! It said, in order for the time transfer field to work, it must be surrounded entirely by thick metal. He put the note back in, and this time he closed and locked the door. 3 minutes later, he opened it again. This time there was another folded sheet of plastic. It said, Dear Mr. Merton, understanding time transfer is very simple. Of course, the science of your time would be unable to build such a machine, but what happens is essentially this. If you put something in your metal box, we can pick it up and bring it to our time. However, there must be an equivalent exchange of matter, so we have to send something to your sensory too. This must be done in accordance with the law of entropy. What we need mostly are historical documents, newspapers, books, and magazines of your era. Please send only factual material, no fiction. We will want fiction later, but not now. Here is a list of things we would like to have. Peter read down the list and blinked in amazement at some of the things. The letter ended with, In return for this, we will send an equal weight of some of our old museum pieces of paper. Papers like the one we took from you. Things called money. Will this be satisfactory? Here is a sample. Yours very truly, Roland Guelph. Money? Peter looked at the bill that was enclosed. It was a $500 note, and they said they would exchange pound for pound. That meant for 1 pound of old newspapers, he would get 1 pound of banknotes. It sounded screwy, but Peter Merton was not a man to argue. If it worked, fine. If it didn't, what could he lose? Peter jammed his hat on his head, folded the list and the $500 in his pocket, and strode out the door. He stopped in the outer office at the desk of Miss Simmons, who was typing up some letters. Come along, Miss Simmons, he said. Get your hat. We have some things to do. Miss Simmons looked startled, but she did as she was bid. 15 minutes later, they were in a second-hand bookshop on 6th Avenue. Peter squinted at the list in the dim light. I want The Story of English by Mario Pei, he said to the proprietor, and The Story of Language by the same author. Give me a copy of the Memoirs of Winston Churchill, He went on like that for several minutes, and the pile of books in front of him began to grow. Then he browsed through the magazine section, looking for back issues of Life, Time, and Scientific American. He told Miss Simmons to get a taxi, and they began loading the stuff in the back seat. Then they drove to the New York Times building and got back issues of the past year. With all this loot, they drove back to the offices of Crabtree & Company. It was during the ride back that Peter wondered whether it was possible that the people of the future had stolen the money that Quiggs had been blamed for and replaced it with a bundle of paper. But he shook his head. It couldn't be. That bundle had been made of cut-up newspapers, and besides, they had Quigley's fingerprints all over them. Miss Simmons helped him get the stuff into his office, and then she said, Mr. Merton, I don't like to butt into your business, but may I ask what all this literature is for? Grinning happily, Peter Merton swore the girl to secrecy, then he told her what had happened. As he finished the story, Miss Simmons began to edge slowly toward the door. And so I had to get these books and things. They're evidently doing research into history. These are books they've lost somehow. Imagine what it would be like if our historians could get copies of the books that were burned at the Library of Alexandria and— Just a minute. Where are you going, Miss Simmons? Miss Simmons smiled a sickly smile. Oh, nowhere. Are you sure you're all right, Mr. Merton? Do I feel— Peter looked blank. Oh, I see. You think I've gone off my rocker. Well, we'll see. Maybe I have, but I don't think so. Look, I'll prove it to you. He scribbled a note to Roloff Guelph and put it inside the safe with a couple of the books. Then he closed the safe. He waited 3 minutes and opened it again. Irene Simmons' eyes opened wide in astonishment, and her mouth formed a crimson O. Tumbling out of the safe came sheaf after sheaf of banknotes. Now do you believe me? Peter asked triumphantly. Yes. What else can I believe? Are they real? He picked one of the bills up and looked at it closely. It's real, all right. I started out in business as a bank teller, and I know how to tell a counterfeit. This is the real McCoy, all right. Well, my goodness, was all Miss Simmons could say for a moment. Then, after the shock of seeing all that money had lessened a little, she asked, What are you going to do with it, Peter? The first thing I'm going to do, he said, is return that $50,000 to Mr. Crabbley. Here, help me gather this stuff up and sort it out into piles. We'll have to count it, too. The girl pitched in willingly and began to sort the bills. Swiftly, they separated it. It was not until then that Peter Morton realized that the girl had called him by his first name. Was it the sight of all the money that had done it? Irene Simmons had never impressed him as the gold-digger type, but— Peter shrugged and went on stacking the money. When they had finished, Irene said, There's not quite enough to pay back Mr. Crabbley. That's easily fixed, Peter said, grinning. He put in some more books, closed the safe, and waited. When he opened it again, more money came tumbling out. This time there was enough to pay back the old man, and more besides. Peter sorted out a pile of the larger bills, enough to make $50,000, and marched to Mr. Crabbley's office. The engraving on the door said, J. Crabbley, President. He rapped deferentially, and when a voice said, Come in, Peter did exactly that. Old man Crabbley looked just like his name. He was a small, wizened, crab-faced man with yellowed skin and a totally bald head. Well, sir, what is it this time? He crackled. Peter began pulling the money out of the briefcase he had packed it in order to carry it to the old man's office. I brought you the money, sir, Peter said. You'll find it all there, $50,000. The old man's eyes lit up with pleasure. Peter could almost see the green glow of money in them. Excellent, said Mr. Crabbley. So the police caught the thief, eh? You'll get 20 years for this. No, sir, Peter replied. They haven't caught Quiggs yet, and they haven't found the money. This is out of my savings. The old man's scraggly brows shot up. Indeed? Savings? I didn't know you actually had that much. Well. He rubbed his hands together and frowned. Well, this is really quite handsome of you, young man. You have more brains than I credited you with. He took out a letter opener and toyed with it. Finally, he said, Peter, my boy, I'll tell you. I really didn't mean that you should do this. I was simply trying to throw a scare into you. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, my boy. I'm going to place this to your account with the firm. Henceforth, you are a junior partner of Crabbley & Company to the tune of $50,000. In addition, I'll have Mr. Twythe, the firm's lawyer, draw up a paper which will give you all rights to whatever money is recovered from Quiggs by the police. Peter started to say something, but old man Crabbley just patted the air with a hand. My boy, think nothing of it. Any young man who can save a sum like that at your age deserves extra consideration. I've always admired a man who can make money. Peter thanked Mr. Crabbley as best he could, and then strolled back to his office feeling a rosy glow. During the following 2 weeks, Peter Merton's personal fortune grew by leaps and bounds. Most of the cash he kept in a trunk in his apartment. He knew that people would start to ask questions if he put too much of it in the bank at once. But he did put considerable sums in the bank nonetheless. The savings account was practically forced on him by Irene Simmons. She insisted that even if he did have money in his trunk, it was conceivable that someone might steal it. Meanwhile, he bought a new Cadillac, several tailor-made suits at $250 per, a fur coat for Irene, and had his apartment completely redecorated, with built-in bar complete. He became quite friendly with Irene Simmons, but he was convinced that the girl liked him simply because he had plenty of money. That didn't bother him too much. She was a beautiful girl, and Peter Merton had always had an eye for beauty. It was in the middle of the third week that things began to change. The first thing that happened was a note from Peter's Futurian correspondent, Rottger. "Dear Mr. Merton," it read, "you have been most cooperative in this endeavor, and we appreciate it greatly. Your books have been very welcome and have strengthened our knowledge of your times and language tremendously. Now, however, we would like a few artifacts of your civilization. Would you please send us some samples of your clothing, both men's and women's styles? We would also appreciate various other things such as—" And here followed another long list, similar to the one he had received before, except that it called for various manufactured objects. The letter was signed as usual, "Very truly yours, Rottger." "Well, what do you think of that?" Peter said, after reading it. Irene read it and said, "I have a dress I can send him, and you can send him one of your suits." Peter nodded. "We'll have to buy some of those other things, though." An hour later, Peter stuffed a suit into the wall safe and closed the door. When he opened it, there was a small bundle of thin, strong material which, when unfolded, proved to be a suit of sorts. It certainly looked different. Irene giggled when he held it out. "You couldn't wear that on the streets. It looks like something out of Flash Gordon or Buck Rogers." Peter grinned and put in Irene's dress. What he got back was a dress, but this time Irene didn't giggle when it was unfolded. "Why, that's perfectly gorgeous," she said in awe. "I wonder if it'll fit." "Here," said Peter, handing it to her. "Go find out. You can lead the fashion field, by a century to be exact." Irene took the dress and headed for the ladies' powder room. When she came back, it was all Peter could do to keep his eyes from popping out. On Irene, the rich, iridescent material made her look like a queen out of a Technicolor extravaganza. "Wow," said Peter feelingly. "It's too bad they don't have suits I can wear." "I'll show you something else, too," Irene said excitedly. "I accidentally spilled some water on it in the powder room, and look what happened." She proceeded to demonstrate by pouring water on her skirt from the carafe on Peter's desk. The water rolled off without wetting the material. Then she took the desk pen and shook some ink on it. "See?" she chortled. "It rolls right off. It never has to be cleaned because it can't get dirty." Peter looked back at the Buck Rogers suit. "Maybe I can get a tailor to make a decent suit out of that thing." Irene shook her head. "I don't think so. There aren't any seams." Peter frowned and took a pair of scissors from his desk drawer. He took one sleeve of the suit and tried to cut it. It wouldn't cut. He jabbed at it with the point. The suit stubbornly refused to cut, snag, or tear. "I wonder," he then said thoughtfully, "if this Rottger would have a suit made for me, one that I could wear." He scribbled out a note and put it in with the next batch of stuff. The reply came back almost immediately. "I can't promise anything, Mr. Merton, but I'll see what I can do. R.G." "Well, that's that," sighed Peter. "I'll just have to wait." Another week passed, and Peter got no word from Rottger. He did, however, get a word from another group of men. He was sitting comfortably in his office, pondering on what to do with all his money, when the intercom on his desk buzzed. "There are some gentlemen from the Treasury Department to see you, Mr. Merton," said Irene's voice. She sounded scared. "Send them in," Peter said. Come to think of it, he felt a little uneasy himself. The two brisk, official-looking young men who came into the office identified themselves as Mr. Brady and Mr. Brown of the United States Treasury Department. They wasted no time in getting down to business. "Now, Mr. Merton," said Brady, "we'd like to know how you're getting all this money." "Well, I saved it," he said. "That's not what I meant," said Brady. "I'm talking about several counterfeit bills that have been traced to you. Where did you get them?" "But they can't be counterfeit," Peter protested. "They are perfectly good bills." "Oh, they're good imitations, all right," Brown said. "The most amazing fakes I've ever seen. The paper is perfect. The engraving is beautiful. In fact, the only thing wrong is the serial numbers. Why, some of those numbers won't be printed on bills for 20 or 30 years yet." "Now, Mr. Merton," said Brady, "tell us where the plates are. Who printed these amazing phonies?" "I don't know," Peter said. He stammered. Frightened, he didn't know what to say. He was afraid to tell them about Rottger Gulf and the time transfer. They'd think he was crazy. "It won't do you any good to lie, Mr. Merton," said Brown. "We got a search warrant this morning and went through your apartment. We found the trunk full of money in your closet. Some of the boys are going over them now, down at the Treasury office." Peter Merton gulped and said nothing. He couldn't. There was a lump in his throat the size of a grapefruit. "Well," Brady said, "if you don't tell us, I'm afraid we'll just have to take you in. Come along, Mr. Merton." Still speechless, Peter walked out of the office between the two men. Peter Merton was sitting in a cell with his head in his hands when he heard the clicking of high heels down the corridor, followed by the heavy tread of a guard's feet. It was Irene. "I got a lawyer for you, Peter," she said breathlessly as she came up to the cell door. The guard leaned against the wall and inspected his fingernails. "I don't think he needs a lawyer, lady. What he needs is a goof doctor. He's flipped his cookie." Peter managed a faint grin. "I told him how I got the money," he said. "They think I'm nuts." "But Peter," she said, "why would Rottger Gulf send counterfeit money?" "He didn't," Peter said. "Don't you see? He got all that money out of a museum. There's probably bills there that were printed in every century for the next 1,000 years. He just sent some bills that won't be printed for 20 years yet." "Well, don't you worry. I'll do something to get you out," she said. "Couldn't we take them up to the office and show them how it works?" "I don't know. Maybe. But Brady said that even if I were telling the truth, they'd have to take all the money away from me." "I don't care about the money," Irene said. "All I care about is getting you out of this horrible place." Suddenly, a door opened at the far end of the corridor, and there were more footsteps. It was Brady and Brown, followed by a man Peter had never seen before. The stranger was saying, "After all, it's only fair that my client be allowed to prove his story, no matter how fantastic it is." "He'll get a chance," Brady said sharply. The stranger turned out to be Q. Bertram Leslie, the lawyer that Irene had engaged. "All right," Brown said to the guard. "Let him out. We'll take over." Then he looked at Peter. "We're going up to your office, Merton, to give you a chance to prove this screwy story you've been telling us about a time machine. I know it's going to be a waste of time, but justice is justice. Come along." It was 6 o'clock when they arrived at the offices of Crabbley and Company, and the office suite was deserted. Irene let the officers in with a key, and they went back to Peter's private office. "Okay," said Bradley. "There's your magic safe. Do your stuff." As Peter began working the combination, Brown said, "By the way, Merton, you'll be interested to know that the Brazilian police have picked up this guy, Quiggs, who stole the $50,000 from you. He claimed he opened the package and there was nothing but a bunch of plastic in it, but the Brazilian cops think they got a lead on it." Peter paid no attention. He wasn't interested in Quiggs' crime right now. He was only interested in his own. He swung open the door and looked inside. There was a folded note from Rottger Gulf. He opened it and looked. "Oh, no," he said weakly. He sat down in a chair. Bradley took the note from his hand and read. "Dear Mr. Merton, we of the Terrestrial Bureau of Historical Research want to extend to you our warmest thanks for your cooperation. We now have most of the information we want about your era. With the valuable information you have given us, we will be able to do a great deal more research and will have much better success in pinpointing our future contacts. It is too bad we could not meet in person, but it is impossible to transfer living things through time. Rest assured that your name will go down in history books as one of our most valuable contacts. The transfer field would be shut off as soon as you receive this note. Naturally, a reversal of transfer will occur. With our warmest wishes, Rolf Gulf. Brady looked up at Peter with what could be called a jaundiced eye. He said, "Did you think this would get you off the hook? How stupid do you think we are? Phony bills, a phony story, phony letter. Merton, you're just plain phony all the way through. Come on along. It's back to the Husko for you. And this time, try—" It is difficult to say what Brady might have suggested that Peter try, for he never finished the sentence. He was interrupted by a sudden roar of sound that reminded him of a broken steam pipe. Suddenly, the air was filled with books, magazines, papers, clothing, shoes, ashtrays, cigarettes, pencils, pens, candy, sandwiches, and 1,001 other things, all spewing from the safe like water out of a fire hose. Amid the confusion, Peter saw Irene running for the door, clad only in the sheerest of bra and panties. "Where is Brady?" shouted Brown. "Why did that girl run off? What happened?" "I'm not sure what happened," Peter said, "but Irene had a perfectly good reason for running off. And as for Brady—" He pointed toward the tremendous heap of stuff on the floor. One hand was groping feebly from its center. Irene sipped out her coffee, while Peter, sitting across the cafe table, explained to her. "Of course, they didn't have a case against me without evidence, and when all the money vanished, they had no evidence. So they had to let me go." "But I don't see exactly why these things vanished," Irene said. "What happened to my beautiful dress? That was terribly embarrassing." But very beautiful, Peter thought. Well, as near as I can figure out, this time transfer business only works so long as the time field is working. As soon as they shut it off, everything went back to its proper time. All the things we gave them came back to us, and all the money and your dress and the other gadgets that we got went back to the 30th century where they belonged. "It's a shame, in a way," Irene said. "We could have used that trunk full of money to get married on." Peter's grin broadened. "Don't worry about that. Remember, Old Man Crabbley gave me the right to keep any money that was recovered from Quiggs." "Did you get it?" Irene asked, excitedly. "Did Quiggs tell where he hid it?" Peter shook his head. "Nope. He didn't steal it. I found the money in that pile of stuff in my office. Evidently, Rolf Gulf was trying out his machine and took the bundle of money and replaced it with another bundle of that queer plastic paper of his. When Quiggs sneaked in, he just stole the bundle from the 30th century, and he put a third bundle in. He got all the way to Brazil before he opened the package and found out he didn't have anything." $50,000, Irene said dreamily. "Well, that ought to be enough to start on anyway." End of Peter Merton's Private Mint by Lee Archer.
Runaway by Alfred Koppel, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Shoesmith. Runaway by Alfred Koppel, Jr. Ripped by an asteroid stray, the spaceship drifted helplessly, until suddenly, across the shuddering deeps, a strange voice called to her. I recall that when I was just a boy, hanging around the old Mojave space yards, there was an old-timer there who used to sing an old song. He learned it from his father, and he from his grandfather, who used to prospect for gold in the Death Valley country. Oh, my darling, oh, my darling, oh, my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever. Dreadful sorry, Clementine. The old-timer was really ancient when I knew him, because he could remember the war with the federal states that used to be called Germany and Japan. There was a strangeness about him, or so it seems to me now. Listening to him sing those pioneer ballads caught at the imagination and woke dreams. Of course, I was young then, and impressionable. but his tales were my gospel. There were some among the yard hands who claimed that he was a survivor of the first crew back from Luna, but that was probably loose talk. In those days, every yard had its selenite man. It was from him, though, that I heard my first spaceman's yarns about the ships that were built when Venus and Mars were the outposts of the system, the frontier. He used to tell of the strange ways in which those old ships took on personality, character, if you like, in the eyes of the men who crewed them. When he spoke, I could almost feel the thrill of those punishing vertical takeoffs, and I could smell the stink of gasoline and feel the icy nimbus of liquid oxygen. I could feel, too, the throbbing of the first crotchety atomics under my feet and the quivering sense of aliveness it gave. Somehow I don't believe the old man was embroidering fantasies for me. I think even then he knew. I grew older and left Mojave for a dozen berths on as many ships, but I never forgot the old-timer and his stories. And it's odd that the ship that proved his claims to me should bear the name he used to sing in that pioneer ballad of his, My First Command, the R.S. Clementine. I know that you'll not believe what I'm going to say about that ship. The Spatial Academy had filled you with book learning and covered you with gold braid, but it's killed your imagination. Academies have a way of doing that. To you this will be an old spaceman's shaggy dog story. No matter. I know what I know. I was there when Clem was born, and I watched her as she went home. Fortunately, atomic drives are outdated now. The new warships are the regular thing. Atomics didn't last long, and in a way, it's a good thing. At least no crew will ever have to go through what mine went through, and no ship turn into a fey thing like Clem did. The strange thing about it is that I cared for that ship. I cared for her from the first moment I saw her lying somnolently among the rusting hulks in the graveyard near Canalopolis. Remember, this was a long time ago. Even then, the old-timer of the Mojave yards must have been 15 years dead and gone. Canalopolis was a desert outpost on the edge of Syrtis Major, cowering under the lash of the everlasting sandstorms. But just then, it was a boom town. A lot of the vital force had drained away from the urge to colonize when Mars and Venus had turned out to be so inhospitable. That's why there were old ships and despair in the Canalopolis yards. It looked as though the outward flood of humanity had reached its limit. The asteroid belt made deep space too dangerous to reach for mere colonization. A catalyst was needed. It was supplied when Carvel's exploratory crew reached Europa and found gold. Gold. In the same way that the cry from Sutter's Mill had brought a flood of new life out to the wilderness that was California centuries back, so Carvel's news brought men out from Terra to seek their fortunes in the darkness of deep space on that tiny, unknown worldlet spinning close to the bosom of mighty Jupiter. The ink on my master's ticket was barely dry when I jumped the Centurion as she dropped grabs at Canalopolis. I was set for a ship of my own. With a few carefully hoarded dollars in my overalls and a lot of brass, I figured that I could get me a command. A few trips through the belt would put me in velvet. Of course, I knew it was dangerous and uncharted, but the canal city was full of grizzled sourdoughs and eager youngsters, all willing to pay plenty for transport to Europa. I figured I couldn't miss. That's where the R.S. Clementine came in. I bought her with a few dollars cash and a whole lot of credit. During those hectic days, a man with a space pilot's license and a master's rating could just about write his own ticket. I signed a note for $50,000 and took possession of the ship. The fueling took $5,000. Inerted plutonium came high on Mars, and the victualling took another $2,000. It didn't bother me. Ink and paper were cheap enough. Then I spent 2 days rounding up a crew on a share and share alike basis, and another day lining up 50 passengers at $2,000 a head. I was in business. My second officer was a grizzled old rum-dum called Swanson. He was a laconic old soul who loved spacing only a jot better than he loved Martian alky. But he was a sharp man for the firing consoles. I never knew a better one. I was lucky to get a physicist, too, though it turned out unlucky for him. He was a green youngster just out of Caltech, who fell prey to the gold fever and found himself stranded on Mars a few million miles from the lode. I talked him into signing on for a minimum of 3 trips on the promise that his share of the take would make him a fine grubstake out on Europa. When I think of it now, I feel as though I personally killed him. He didn't want to help crew Clem, but he was on the spot, and I talked him into it. Green as grass he was. But he had brains. Brains for working atomics, nothing else. Holcomb, his name was. I'll never forget it. The R.S. Clementine, it was shortened to Clem even before takeoff, was an atomic multiple-pulse 300-footer. The pile that drove her was housed in a long sheathed tube shaft that ran from just aft of the control deck to the nozzles along her longitudinal axis. It was an inefficient system, but to me it looked like pure beauty. After all, she was my first command. At 22:30, on 2/13/49 Mars date, we blasted off for Europa with 50 passengers, 9 crewmen, and a hold full of mining equipment. In that 300-foot hull, we were like sardines packed in a can. Sure, it was profiteering, but have you ever seen prosperity without it? The trip out was almost too uneventful. We found a clear channel through the belt and came through without a change of course. In those days, no one had ever heard of deflectors, and a free passage through the belt was a 1 in 1,000 chance. Yet, being young and a bit cocky, I was willing to attribute it to my own spacemanship. I imagined the trip back would be even easier. The greeting we got at Europa didn't do much to teach me humility either. Not many ships were getting through, and those miners wined and dined us in true frontier style. It took 6 hours to unload our passengers and their gear, and another hour to round up a payload for the hop back to Mars. It was mostly ore and mail, but we did get 2 passengers. We refueled out on the airless, rocky plain that served Europa as a space yard. Jupiter seemed to fill the sky. Deep space was a new experience to us, and never had we grounded on a planet or moon so near to so large a primary. There were several cases of vertigo caused by the crazy feeling that we were upside down when we looked up at that hellishly big orb in the sky. That was one of the ever-present dangers on Europa. Enough of it, and you found your mind going. One passenger was a miner that cracked like that. The other was an attendant from the Triplanetary Medical Mission that had established a small base on the moonlet. In other words, his keeper. The psycho came aboard in a straitjacket, and a blank, bewildered look twisted his face as he climbed woodenly into the central valve. The attendant didn't look a great deal saner. Still, I was supremely confident, and my passenger's afflictions didn't worry me at all. I was busily counting my imaginary profits as soon as we blasted free. To say that I was pleased with myself would be an understatement. Clem sought the sky like the proverbial homesick angel, her atomics throbbing beautifully under the care of Holcomb and his tube gang. Swanson and I set her into a hyperbolic trajectory with a couple of flourishes of the graphites, and Jupiter moved into the proper position dead astern. It was all too easy. A week passed before we crossed the outermost periphery of the belt. Clem slipped between 2 small-sized mountains, and we were in. For several hours the screens showed clear sky, and then came the deluge. There was no 1 in 1,000 clear channel waiting for us this time. I learned what crossing the belt really meant, but fast. Swanson and I sat at the consoles, eyes glued to the screens, sweat oozing off our ribs, icy sweat, smelling of fear. Clem shuddered and jolted as we slammed her about, twisting and dodging, as those chunks of rock came hurtling at us out of nowhere. Hour after wrenching hour it continued, until we ached all over from the beating we were taking. We were almost through, when the hatch behind us flew open with a crash, and a screeching, wailing mass of humanity threw itself upon us. In a flash I knew what had happened. The jolting of the ship must have knocked the attendant out, and the crazy miner had somehow managed to free himself. He'd found his way to the control deck, sobbing with mixed rage and terror. He connected the gyrations of the ship with the men who were handling her, and he was wild with terrified fury. For 5 hideous minutes, Swanson and I struggled with him, trying to protect ourselves, and at the same time keep Clem away from those ever-present asteroids that swam continuously into the range of the screens. Finally, Swanson got a clear shot at him with one of those ham-like fists of his, and the psycho banged backward across the control, his head crashing with sickening force into the sharp edge of the pressure suit lockers. He oozed down to the floor plates like a sack of wet mush. I knew without touching him that he was dead. But the damage had been done. The ship had blasted around so that she was slewing sideways to the axis of her trajectory and in no position to maneuver. I leaped for the firing consoles as I caught sight of a small asteroid spinning in toward us. I caught the proper key, but I was too late. There was a rending, tearing crash as the missile sliced into Clem's flank. The lights flickered and went out, and there was a whooshing sound as air gushed from the ruptured compartments. The automatic damage control system cut in then, and there was the sound of airtight doors banging shut throughout the ship. The glowing meters on the panels danced crazily, and the power dial's needle banged hard against the peg and back to 0 in one movement. Then there was silence. Clem was dead in space. For a few stunned moments, Swanson and I sat on the deck staring at one another. There was an expression of shocked disbelief on the rummy's face. There was one on mine too, I know. No matter how many times you brush with the violent ending, no human mind can accept the true inevitability of unsolicited death. We can't ever really accept the fact that this is it. Always some corner of our minds keeps thinking that the end is not yet. That's the way it was with us. We simply did not believe the thing that had happened to us. Our ship was a pierced derelict, and we stood practically no chance of getting through now. But we couldn't accept it. A semblance of sanity returned, and Swanson dragged 2 pressure suits out of the locker. In tight silence we donned them and started for the locked hatch. I had no idea just how badly Clem was hurt, but hope always remains after everything else is gone, so I had to find out. We forced the hatch and watched the air vanish in an icy cloud down the dark corridor. The break in the hull was large. I knew because the sonar in my suit didn't pick up any hissing. The tube shaft, with its precious pile, was our objective. If that was unhurt, there was still a chance. Fortunately, we had been almost through the belt when the collision came, so except for an occasional small bit of rock banging against the hull, the space around us was clear. On the way down toward the shaft, we looked in on the medic. He was dead from asphyxiation, his face blue and bloated with internal pressure. The psycho had jammed the airtight hatch of their compartment with a piece of luggage, so that the safety device had failed when the air went. We left him there and continued down the companionway. After a bit we met 3 pressure-suited figures, and I breathed easier. It was Holcomb and 2 of his crew from the shaft. Off watch, they'd been in the forecastle when the asteroid hit. Now they were trying to force their way into the shaft through a badly warped and fused hatch. From the condition of the walls and deck plates, I could see that we must be very near the spot where the missile cut into the ship. And even out where we were, our wrist guides were clicking pettishly, showing that the thing had hit on or at least near the pile. Near enough to warp the insulating plates. I sent Swanson and one of the tube men down to the equipment locker for torches, and as soon as they returned we began cutting into the shaft. Even with atomic torches it took us a long time, because those walls were foot-thick leaded steelumen. Finally the glowing section of hatch fell away, and a wave of vertigo swept over me. It seemed that I was about to step through the cutaway into eternity. Close to the hatch was a jagged hole that knifed through 1/2 the ship's girth from the shaft to free space. It was as though a mighty hand had punched a steel forefinger halfway through a cylinder made of butter. The jagged holes of the hole were fused and melted into grotesque stalactites, and beyond gleamed the stars against a backdrop of diffuse nebulosity that was the Milky Way. As we watched, they moved lazily across the irregular patch of sky. Clem was turning slowly on her axis, one with the mindless drift of the cosmic dust cloud that was the belt. I stepped through into the shaft. The damage had to be ascertained, for the 3 life ships would never take us all the way to Mars. They were not atomic, and their range was sharply limited, 500,000 miles at most. The remains of the asteroid was a congealed mass filling the lower end of the shaft, and bits of machinery and shards of plating were scattered about the deck. The tube men who had been in the shaft at the time of collision might have been the charred lumps stuck to the wall plates. I didn't want to know. The pile itself had been ripped open in one place, and a threatening glow emanated from the torn place, setting our geigs whirring. I knew we could stand the radiation in small dosages, since our suits were insulated, but not for long. Repairs had to be made quickly, if they could be made at all. Using the pieces of plating that lay about, Holcomb, Swanson, and I set about mending the break with the torch. That was the first time I became conscious of the strangeness. Not many men even today have looked into a plutonium pile. It was eerie, that light within. It was like the essence of life, mindless, unknowing, but vibrantly alive beyond any human comparison. The break was almost healed when the thing happened. I don't know of any other way to express it. The slow rotation of the ship brought the hole in her side into line with the sun, and for a long moment the brilliant light burned down on us and into the pile. In that timeless minute I felt the interplay of forces greater than the human mind can conceive. The pile and the sun glared at one another. There's no other way it can be said. They looked at each other, and something happened. The sun called to that mindless life that was the essence of Clem, and she answered. She did. And all the others felt it too. In that instant the atomic fire in Clem's heart, that fire spawned of the sun, awoke, and there was oneness. The sunbeam passed and darkness fell once again in the shaft. All of us stood about in silence, all of us convinced of what we had seen and felt, and yet each afraid to give voice to it. Colloidal life is too vain somehow to admit another, more vital sort of life into our neat little cosmos. Even when the proof of it happens before your eyes, you pass it off as imagination. We did, or tried. The pile subsided into a sullen glow, and we pushed the thing from our minds. We had seen nothing, and men in danger are sometimes confused. That's the way we rationalized it. Quickly then we finished the repairs, and Holcomb tested for power. The meter snapped to life eagerly. We had our ship again, and we could proceed. An hour before we had felt doomed, but now Mars and safety seemed near at hand. The passengers, of course, were both dead. 3 tube men had perished in the shaft. That left 6 crewmen and 3 officers, and Clem. We retreated from the shaft because of the radiation that still leaked through the sprung shielding, and somehow or other all of us managed to stay out for the next 2 weeks. Living in suits was hard on the nerves. One doesn't often think of all the inconveniences involved, but having your beard grow in your helmet, for instance, where you can't get at it to use depilatory, is hard to take. Even the most elementary body functions become fantastically complicated, and the result is always shattered nerves. But the terrific breach in the hull made it necessary. Only the control deck was truly airtight after the collision, and the men were quarreling continuously about who should get the long watches there. Then, too, every time the hatch was opened, new air had to be pumped in, and the pressure tanks were dangerously low. That's why we called it imagination born of jangled nerves, when we began to notice a difference in the way the ship handled. There was a certain recalcitrant sluggishness about her responses to course corrections, and she showed a marked preference for sunward trajectories rather than for the hyperbolics I computed Marsward. Yet we chose to ignore all the symptoms. On the 15th day after the collision, I was in the dorsal blister checking our position by means of bubble tetrant and star shots. Mars already had begun to show a definite disk, and I felt better than I had in days. My flight of fancy was short-lived. 3 sights told me that we were off course. Unaccountably, of course, for we had made no major corrections in the last week. Instead of pointing at the spot in space where we would intercept Mars, we were 5 degrees sunward. I triggered my suit radio and called to Swanson in control. "Swanson here, Captain." His voice came back in my earphones. "We're 5 degrees sunward of our plotted course, Swanson," I said. "Correct immediately." He sounded miffed as he replied, "Mars is right in the crosshairs of the course scope, sir, right where she's been for the last week." I told him to stand by and checked my star sights again. I had made no error. We were a full 5 degrees off course, and the deviation was growing larger momentarily. I could easily detect it with my tetrant out here in the seldom-used blister. Yet in the course scope in control, Mars showed centered in the crosshairs. Why? Even as I asked myself that question, my mind flashed back to that awful moment in the tube shaft. Almost wildly, I thrust the thought away from me. Yet if that thing I had felt really lived and was intelligent, could it control the images that showed in instruments that were an integral part of the ship, of its own body? Could it control those so that such an error as this could not be discovered, except by the off chance that someone should make a direct check with star sights outside the ship itself? There was a craftiness about the disparity that frightened me. I forced myself to relax, and I laughed half-heartedly at my imaginings. The weeks spent living under trying conditions in a crippled ship had made me susceptible to vaporings. I gave Swanson the correction again. "There must be something wrong with the scope relays, Swanson. Maybe the jar of the crash bollocks them," I said. "Correct with 5.5 to port. Plane is okay." "Aye, sir," grumbled Swanson. I laid the tetrant in its rack and turned to leave the blister, just as the ship began to throb under the impact of the correcting thrust from the nozzles. I glanced back over my shoulder for a last look at the sky, and the hair on the nape of my neck stood erect. Instead of correcting the course, the blast had veered Clem's nose a full 10 degrees farther to starboard, so that she pointed straight at the sun. My voice was shaky as I called control again. "Swanson, you rummy, you gave her starboard blast instead of port. Damn it, man, you've taken us another 10 degrees further off arc." "But, Captain," protested Swanson, "I gave her what you ordered." "I ordered 5.5 to port," I shouted angrily. "I gave her 5.5 to port," Swanson howled. Holcomb cut into the conversation from his metering station near the shaft. He sounded shaky with fright. He called for 5.5 to port, Captain, and that's what I gave him, but something's wrong. She's not responding." "Cut all power," I ordered sharply. "We'll have to check all the controls." There was a moment of tense silence before Holcomb's voice came back, more frightened than before. "She won't cut off. I can't kill the drive. She's got the bit in her teeth, and—" "Holcomb!" My voice filled the plexiglass bubble of my helmet. I was afraid the youngster was going to say the very thing I had been thinking a few moments before, and I didn't want to hear it. The physicist subsided for a minute, and Swanson cut in. "Mars shows properly in the course scope now, Captain. Way off to one side." Holcomb's laugh made cold chills run up and down my backbone. "She doesn't care now," he bubbled. "She doesn't care if we know now, because we can't control her. She's going home, and we can't stop her." I dove through the blister hatch and ran down the ramp toward the metering station, shouting for Swanson to get into a suit and join me there. Fear followed me like a writhing black shade down the dark companionways. I was afraid for Holcomb's mind, and I was afraid of something else, something that had no name or shape. I was afraid of Clem, of the thing I knew for certain now she had become. When I reached Holcomb, he was calm. His outburst seemed to have sobered him, and for that, at least, I could be thankful. We waited for Swanson to join us, and then we went into the shaft. Soberly, we stood near the pile, feeling the strangeness of the alien life that lived as hellish atomic fire in the shielded tube nearby. We could feel a probing in our minds, alien fingers fishing about curiously, but with cautious reserve of a precocious child. It was Swanson who put it into words, finally, simple, prosaic words. "The blinkin' can has come alive," he muttered. That tore it. Swanson hadn't an imaginative bone in his body, and if he felt it, it was. My mind flashed back across the years to the old man of the Mojave Yards and his stories about living ships. The living thing that was the sun, the thing that had given birth to Clem's soul, had gleamed in on that soul through the break in the plates, and in doing that it had posed on Clem awareness. Awareness that she was part of the mighty life stream of the cosmos, part of the living fires of the stars. In a way that human minds could but dimly grasp, the sun had spoken to Clem and called her, and this was the result. Understand, there was nothing malign about her. Not just then. She was almost childlike, pure, brilliant, willful. We jerry-rigged a control set right there in that shaft, hoping to cut across the linkages from the top deck, but it was futile. I had the insane notion that she was laughing at us in our pestering efforts to re-establish dominance over her. We tried withholding fuel, but that was no good. There was enough plutonium already in the pile to take us across the system, certainly enough to take us where she wanted to go. We didn't want to guess about that. Holcomb and I tried slipping the cadmium emergency dampers into the pile. The first one slipped in easily. But the moment the drop in activity registered, the second rod fused in the slip shaft. It was the same with all the rest. We could not insert them. Clem would not be anesthetized. She was protecting herself, calmly, almost reproachfully. I really believe she was learning about men and their will to command even things they can never really understand. That's the way it went. If the crossing of the belt had been nightmarish, the next weeks were insane. Our every attempt to re-establish control was thwarted easily by the mind in the pile. Mars fell astern and Clem swung inward toward the sun. For a while Terra blazed green and bright off our starboard bow almost at eastern quadrature. Then she, too, began to fade behind us as the possessed ship drove ever sunward. I think we were all a little mad during those terrible days. We lived with the knowledge that we were helplessly at the mercy of the ship. Gradually we admitted to ourselves where she was taking us. We realized where home was. We took to sitting dully in the control room, still clad in suits that we were too lethargic to remove, and staring at the silvery disk of Venus that daily grew larger in the forward screens. We were sitting so when the tension broke Holcomb. One minute he was as morosely silent as the rest of us, and the next he had seized a spanner and burst screaming out of the room. His voice was like nothing human. "I won't let her do it," he was shrieking. "I won't let her take me." Automatically the rest of us got to our feet and started after him. It was as though none of us really cared, but we felt that we should do something. Just what, no one seemed to have figured out. We clumped heavily down the companionways after him toward the open hatch that led to the tube shaft. In our helmet radios his voice was a continuous, tinny and distorted harangue. "The sun! The sun! She's going to it. It called her and she's going to it. But she won't take me." And then laughing wildly, the gibbering mirth of a madman. His laughter woke me. "Holcomb!" I yelled. "Come back!" Jammed in the narrow corridor, we struggled after him. "She won't take me. I won't let her take me." Holcomb was screaming. "I'll kill her. I'll tear the rotten life out of her. Kill her." We reached the hatchway in time to see the crazed physicist tearing at the moorings of the pile with his spanner. Already he had one of the safety latches loose and was banging furiously at the second. Instinctively we reeled back, for our wrist guides whirled as deadly amounts of radiation fanned out from the bent housing. Holcomb, bathed in a rain of invisible death, was too engrossed in tearing the last hatch free. The latch that would free the pile and send it spilling out of the nozzles into space. Then Clem struck. How can I describe the horror of it? Insensate metal came to life, became enraged. And it killed, deliberately and without conscience. The overhead crane that carried the plutonium ingots to the pile moved. It swung its claw down to pick up a sharp shard of steel that lay on the deck. Like a hand, it picked it up, aimed, struck. Edge first, the jagged fragment caught Holcomb across the shoulders, shearing his slender body in two and leaving the two uneven halves twitching on the dark floor. An aura of pure, ravening hate filled the shaft. Clem had showed her teeth. Swanson laughed, and the sound chilled me. I knew then we were all going mad. The intricate system of checks and balances that nature built into our brains could not stand another hour of this. I slapped Swanson's face with my gloved hand, and he stopped laughing. But his face was a frozen, distorted thing. I knew mine was the same, for utter terror was choking the breath from me, and I wanted to run screaming from the terrible hate that filled the shaft and from the bloody, mangled thing on the deck. I managed to make my voice understandable only by biting hard on my lips until the pain steadied me. I gave the order to abandon ship. With only a little luck, we could make Venusport, but I would have abandoned ship if we'd been halfway between here and Centaurus. I divided the men into 3 groups, 2 men and an officer to each life ship, except the last. 2 tube men alone in that one. I took the controls of the first one myself after setting the finders of the other 2 on my own ship so that I could do the astrogation for all 3. Then, without another look at our accursed ship, we slammed out of the jettisoning valve into free space. The cool stars and the nearby silvery disk of Venus calmed me somewhat. The tremendous vistas of space were something familiar and real, and we were free. But we had bargained without Clem. The encounter with young Holcomb had changed her. He had tried to kill her, tried to sunder her body. The childish core of her had become that hateful thing we had felt in the shaft. She had been attacked, and her reaction was quick and dreadful. Almost before we were out of her shadow, she turned in an impossibly short arc and charged us, atomic hell blazing from her tail. Like a vengeful comet, she sought us out. I called to the other ships to scatter, and they leaped away from us like arrows. One went up and to starboard, the other went down and to port. I gave my own tiny boat full throttle and headed straight for the bright crescent of Venus. Clem would not be denied. One of the life ships was caught in her tail flare, and I saw it vanish in an incandescent blot as the heat detonated the tank of monoatomic hydrogen it carried. Debris fanned out from the scene of the explosion, banging against our ship's flanks. And still the infuriated metal monster was not satisfied. She caught the second life ship, Swanson's, about 50 miles astern of us and gored it to death with her needle-sharp prow. Clem swung in a wide circle and bore down on us. At her speed, I knew she would run us down in seconds, and there was nothing left to do. I closed my eyes and waited. Death did not come. Instead, there was a wave of something like emotion. It was disgust and impatience and sharp command. A mighty something was talking, not to us, and not in words or even symbols we could truly understand, but the power of it was so great that we could catch the overtones, the emotional nuances that surcharged it. Something was talking to Clem, commanding her to forget her childish wrath and come. As though jerked around by a cosmic leash, the crazed ship veered about, her tail flare blinding us. When we could see again, she was a spark far sunward and driving at incredible speed. In tight silence, the 2 crewmen and I watched her for hours, until she vanished into the bright glare of the sun. After that we followed her with the radar, eyes intent on the golden blip steadily moving inward toward the yellow mass of Sol. We drifted in space, just watching and waiting. And then at last the fleck of golden light blended with the sun. I knew even as I watched her that she did not die. No. There was maturity and satisfaction and ineffable pleasure flooding out from the spot where she vanished, but no nuance of death. We turned away, emptied of emotion or even thought. In a numb trance we found our way into Venusport. We didn't explain. By unspoken consent we said nothing about the thing we had witnessed. It was too new, too fresh, and it was too unlike life as we know it. The port authorities listed us as shipwrecked by collision with an errant asteroid, and we got passage back to Terra and sanity. It was a long time before I ventured into space again, and every time I look up at the sun, I have the feeling that I have seen something no human should. I saw Clem go home. End of Runaway by Alfred Koppel, Jr.
The Light on Precipice Peak by Stephen Tall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The three young men sat quietly and watched the faint, eerie glow. It was ruddy and small, a spot of dull red color. For perhaps 5 or 6 minutes it showed, moving slowly along what seemed to be the lip of Bighorn Glacier, 6 miles away and 7,000 feet up in the thin, cold air. Then it vanished. John Drinkard lowered his binoculars. "Well, that's that. You can see it, but still you can't. The glasses don't help a bit." "Spooks," said Chuck Evers. He wriggled his muscular shoulders, slipped down onto the small of his back in the chair, and propped long legs on the porch railing. "Spooks?" Carl Royston's brow wrinkled puzzledly. Drinkard and Evers both watched with suppressed amusement as his face suddenly cleared and he almost smiled. "Ah, yes, apparitions." "Haunts," Chuck said. "Hobgoblins, ghosts, banshees." "Banshees wail," said Drinkard. Royston's pale eyes glowed with interest. "This you can say for the lights of Precipice Peak. They are quiet." "Are you sure?" John Drinkard asked. "How do you know that every coyote you hear is a coyote?" "At any rate," said Royston, "if they make sounds, they are the sounds of the country." He shivered slightly. "A miserable country," he added. John Drinkard was thick and blocky, with big hands and a square chin. Chuck Evers was long and sinewy. Beside them, Royston seemed a pale, slight figure, his thin face sallow, his shoulders ever hunched against the crisp western air. "You are speaking of the land I love," said Chuck Evers. "If you don't like it, why stay around?" Royston shrugged. "It is supposed to make me a man of vigor, with red corpuscles and a need for cold shower baths. Actually, there is nothing wrong with me. I was simply born to sit and watch while great louts like you run and wrestle and climb and sweat." He shifted his gaze to the peak, now a dark silhouette against the ice-clear stars. "There, the light shows again." Slowly the red glow progressed along a cliff face, much higher than it had before. For minutes it moved along steadily, then faded. "That thing," said Evers suddenly, "was going along 5th Avenue. Spooks don't need a route of ascent, even up Precipice. All of a sudden, the lights of Precipice Peak are getting solid. I got a feeling they'll leave sign." "Sign?" Royston's voice went up in the darkness. There was the familiar pause, then Royston's satisfied tone. "Ah, yes, traces." "Right, traces, tracks, spoor. Only mystery about those lights is we don't know who makes them. But they're getting to be a tourist attraction. Maybe that's a lead." "How many trips have there been up Precipice this season?" Royston queried softly. 15 or so, John Drinkard said. "And the boy has something. Any sign on 5th Avenue or across Bighorn would have been seen by now. There have been some good mountain men on the peak this summer. Some of them don't miss much." Royston hugged his narrow shoulders and made himself small in his chair, shivering again as the chill mountain breeze blew across the porch of the lodge. "Over the swamps of my native Louisiana, where I wish I now was, I've seen balls of fire go drifting. It is swamp gas, methane, slowly oxidizing and glowing. Could this on the mountain be something like—" "It's almost impossible," said Evers. "And anyhow," he added stubbornly, "balls of gases wouldn't follow a trail. Those blasted lights do." John Drinkard rose easily, stretched his thick arms wide. "Tomorrow, Chuck, tomorrow," he reminded. "Take it easy, boy. Tomorrow you can look for yourself, remember? At daybreak we go up to solve the mystery of the lights." "Ghastly," said Royston. "To go out at dawn is as bad as eating raw flesh. But tap on my cabin door when you go by. I will wave to you from the window." John Drinkard swung his nailed short boots along the trail with a steady, satisfying rhythm. Ahead of him, Chuck Evers set the pace, an easy, loose-jointed shamble that ate up the mountain miles. They were a good team. They felt the trail alike. Drinkard swelled his big chest, then exhaled gustily, as though to expel the last of the tainted air of the settlements below. He warmed slowly to a climbing approach, and he would have liked a breather. Ahead, the trail switched back sharply. At the switchback, Evers broke his stride, swung the pack-sack from his shoulders, and leaned his long frame against a boulder. "Break," he said. "I heard you heave like a foundered mule." John Drinkard grinned. He shrugged off his own pack. "It'll be good to enjoy the view and not have to look at your silly hat." Chuck tilted the Swiss mountaineer's hat, complete with eagle feather. "These are the Alps of America," he observed, "so my hat is fitting." "It doesn't even fit you," said Drinkard. Forests of lodgepole pine and spruce lay below them. Already the resort town seemed a toy settlement at the edge of the valley, and the sagebrush world stretched away east to the horizon. To the north, the big peaks of the range tumbled in a massive orderly row, with lakes flashing along their bases and a vast and timbered plateau rearing up beyond. It was west. Good American west, 20th century and solid, with clean cold mountain air, yellow sunlight on the cliffs, and snowfields above. As if by signal, both men turned their gazes upward. The cutback was a vantage point from which could be seen the jumble of ridges and crags surmounted by the glistening white expanse of Bighorn Glacier, and, higher still, the seamed front of the eastern face of the mountain, tapering upward to the pinnacle of the peak. The men swung up their pack-sacks and shook hands. "Good luck, friend," said John Drinkard. "Let's go and see if our names are still on the register up there." "Good luck," said Evers. "Tonight we'll be up where the lights are. Punch me if you see one first." "Lights nuts," John Drinkard said. "There'll be none while we're on the peak. $5 says so." Evers raised his eyebrows. "I'm not a rich man, but I love a sporting chance. Here's my 5. Where'll we put 'em?" Drinkard fumbled in his jacket pocket, brought out a tobacco tin. He poured the remaining tobacco into a pouch and held out the tin. "Stick it in there," he said. "Here's mine." A few paces off the trail, John Drinkard pried up a stone, slipped the tin underneath. "Light's yours, no light's mine, right?" "Right," said Evers, and he grinned at the little added spice for the 2 days ahead. Their steady plodding passage up the ever-dimming trail was an appreciative one. Going into the world above the trees was one of the good things of a peak climb. Hoary marmots whistled from their rocks. Conies scurried. Brown and gray-barred ptarmigan crouched almost invisibly among the gaudy alpine fields of avens and mountain sunflowers and tiny forget-me-nots. At near dusk they laid out their bedrolls on a level bit of tundra in the lee of a massive outcrop near Bighorn Glacier. A small fire of dead branches of firs and pines that literally crawled on their bellies at this altitude cooked a kettle of stew and heated the water for tea. The men went through the simple chores of an evening camp, with the ease that comes when things have been done many times. And when Chuck Evers walked a few paces from the fire, stepped on a small stone that rolled with his weight, he felt with a sort of irritated surprise the little thread of pain that ran through his ankle. Tentatively, he tested the foot, then hobbled back to the fire. He knew that he wouldn't climb the peak in the morning. He said nothing to Big John until he had stripped off the boot and heavy sock. Then, as Drinkard came back to the fire with more wood, he held out the ballooning ankle. "How are you taping, friend?" he asked casually. Drinkard looked at the foot, already purpling as it swelled. He reached for his first aid kit. "Well, anyway," he said resignedly, "you got close enough to watch for lights." Evers set his teeth as Drinkard's big fingers probed the sprain. "We'll pack ice on it," Drinkard decided, "then tape it in an hour. Maybe it's a simple twist." "You know it isn't." "Sure," admitted Drinkard. "I thought you wanted to be cheerful, that's all. It's like when I broke 3 ribs climbing to look into a bird's nest the day before we were tackling the east face of Long's. Then you were chin up." "That was different," said Evers. "I wasn't hurting." When the stars were out and the quarter moon rose from the plains, John Drinkard got up from his bedroll seat by the fire. The 2 men had sat talking quietly for an hour. Evers' ankle was taped and he was easing it before him as best he could. "I'm going to have a look before I turn in," said Drinkard. "My 5 still says there won't be lights, but the technical crew may be monkeying around somewhere." "Take it easy," Chuck Evers said. "I'll just skirt along the edge of the glacier. Back in half an hour. You take it easy." Drinkard knew Bighorn Glacier. Its crevices were so consistent that they were shown on maps. He carried his ice axe, but had no mind to use it. Only after he had worked his way for a number of minutes along the edge of the moonlit ice sheet did the whim to cross it seize him. The glacier had a good snow covering. The going was easy, and the view was something few men see. Drinkard automatically avoided the big ice cracks, then slipped through a snow roof into a shallow temporary one. He wasn't hurt. The moonlight from the crack above showed his ice axe beside him. It was a lucky fall, except for the fact that he couldn't get out again. Time after time he tried to dig hand and foot holes into the splintery ice wall, but he was freezing his fingers and making no headway. He was stoutly, but not heavily clothed. The cold began to bite into him. He settled himself on his heels quietly and tried to decide what to do. After an hour, Chuck Evers began to call. John Drinkard knew that if he answered, Chuck would probably attempt the ice himself. Evers' voice came now in measured regular yips. And while John wavered, from the crags above the glacier he was answered. It was a strange voice, yet oddly not unfamiliar. To John Drinkard it was muffled, but it had a reassuring sound. Drinkard waited in silence. Not many minutes later, a dark silhouette showed in the narrow crack of sky above. From the voice's first call, Drinkard had realized that they had been watched, probably all day. "Are you injured?" asked the man's odd voice. "I'm okay," Drinkard said. "Just drop me a rope and I can walk up the wall. Mind the snow ledge. I didn't, and look at me." The man chuckled. "A joke," he said, almost tentatively. "Here is the rope." John Drinkard caught the loop lowered to him. Its texture was strange to his mountaineer's hands. It was down soft, warm to the touch, and he felt its strength instinctively. He climbed it easily, hand over hand. The stranger stood 3 strides back from the crevice lip, negligently holding the rope with one heavy gauntleted hand. Yet he was slender, slight of build, and when Drinkard rose to his feet, he towered over his rescuer. Big John thrust out his hand. "Well, thanks. Lucky for me, somebody has sense enough to walk around ice cracks." The man seemed to hesitate, then extended his own gloved hand. "You must not mind the glove," he said. "It is for your protection. The hand has not yet cooled." John Drinkard was glad of the dimness of the moonlight, for his jaw dropped. But the man turned promptly away. "Come," he said. "I have made an easy way. The one with the swollen foot is concerned for you." John Drinkard, who had climbed scores of peaks up and down the Rockies, followed and felt like a tenderfoot. The man's odd voice and stilted phrases tantalized him, yet he knew they were not entirely strange. And the matter of the hot hand... Drinkard dropped back a couple of paces. The man was setting his booted feet into a line of holes that had not been on the glacier earlier. Drinkard would have sworn to that. They made the traverse of the ice field a simple matter. As they approached the glacier's edge, Drinkard realized that he could see his companion with an amazing clarity. He seemed limned with a dim red glow which grew brighter with each step. In a few moments he became as a man outlined in flame, and Drinkard could feel a warmth radiating from him. Yet the snow did not melt under his tread. "It is the boots," said his guide, just as though Drinkard had spoken his thoughts aloud. "They insulate." John Drinkard held on to his poise with something of an effort. "Thank you," he managed dryly. "Not only do you light up, but you pick brains. They're both good tricks." The man ahead chuckled tentatively. "A joke?" he said, but it was almost a question. He really doesn't know, thought John Drinkard in astonishment. "That is true," admitted his guide. "Everything else I understand with ease. Even the many kinds of speech are not difficult. But only on Earth are there jokes. We can never be sure about them." "We, huh? I thought a gag like this would take cooperation. How many of you boys are in on it?" They had left the ice and were threading along the little edge that gave onto the boulder field. "We are 4, said the man. He seemed to sense no sarcasm in the question. Drinkard noted, almost without surprise, that the ruddy glow had faded completely and that the man was simply a dark silhouette ahead. They reached the tundra, and Chuck Evers' voice hailed them from close by. He sat near the tiny fire, the taped foot and ankle eased onto a pack sack before him. "Well," said Evers, "you took your time." "I fell in a crevice," John Drinkard said, "and I owe you $5. You should put the more important statement first, but we can take that up later. I see we have company. I'm sorry. His rescue from the crevice and the little trek back across the glacier had been like something from a dream to John Drinkard. But now with the familiar figure of Chuck across the fire, things suddenly assumed their proper proportions again. He faced his guide, who stood silently by. "This is Chuck Evers. I'm afraid I didn't catch your name." The man's thin face showed palely from the peaked hood that covered his head and disappeared into the bulky collar of his stout, steel-smooth jacket. "I am called Dizelle," he said quietly. The two men stared at him, and he returned their looks with composure. "It's different, anyway," said Chuck finally. "Yes," agreed the man. "That is because I am different." "He can read your head like a crystal ball and light up like a neon sign," John Drinkard heard himself babbling. Evers, though he sensed the strangeness of the situation, turned to Drinkard with concern. "Easy, boy," he said soothingly. "You've slipped on the ice before. Sit down and let's quit being funny." The stranger smiled, but his curving lips seemed more a studied imitation than any indication of mirth. "Let us all sit, and I will tell you why I am Dizelle. I will do it because I know, when you repeat my words, that you will not be believed." Evers started to speak, thought better of it, and closed his mouth with an exaggerated snap of teeth. John Drinkard sat warily on the soft tundra vegetation. "You came up to climb the peak," said the man Dizelle. "But also you came to see what caused the lights. If you had not had misfortune, you would have climbed the peak, but there would have been no lights." He glanced away, up across the rocky ride into the upper reaches of the glacier. A dull red glow moved down the route he and John Drinkard had recently taken. Keen eyes could readily see that it had the shape of a man. "That is Dazor," said Dizelle. "We grew in the same membrane. He is erasing our trail across the ice, John Drinkard." Drinkard watched the glow until it slowly faded. "Very smart. We can tell tales, but there won't be any proof, huh?" "That is correct," said the strange man. He turned to Chuck Evers. "You wonder about the statement that we grew in the same membrane. I should have said that we are twins." Evers caught his breath. "Telepathy," he breathed. John wasn't out of his head. The chill night wind rippled across the alpine field. The little fire flicked and glowed. Overhead the stars were blue and red and yellow ice. "The truth is simple," said the man called Dizelle. "We have told it before, but no one believed, and it has not seemed wise to support our facts. We, Dazor and I, with our companions, Dazin and Dazette, are explorers." John Drinkard slapped his hand against the boulder beside him and seemed reassured by its solidity. He shook his head to clear it. "I don't get it," he objected. "Chuck and I could call ourselves explorers too, if rambling around the mountains every chance we get falls under that heading." "We do not explore the mountains," said Dizelle. "Here we rest and allow ourselves to behave normally. We explore in the towns and in the cities where people gather. It is strenuous," he added, with a sound almost like a sigh. "We cannot tolerate it for long. Then we must go into seclusion and renew ourselves." Keen interest was replacing puzzlement in both Evers and Drinkard. They smiled now, and Chuck said, "I know what you mean. 10 days in Denver. A fine town, mind you, and I feel like I've been staked with a short rope." "You do not exactly know what I mean," said Dizelle. "Your problems are simply matters of preference. Ours are physiological. We cannot long maintain metabolic balance in the company of people. Thus, Dazin and Dazette are now in the world you inhabit. When they must rest, then our turn comes." Dizelle had gathered a pile of small flat stones, and he sat sorting them with his gauntleted fingers. They were simply flakes of weathering gneiss, fire and pressure derived from some granite as ancient as the range. Neither man noticed the idle movements until Dizelle raised a piece to his mouth and bit into it with a grinding sound, like a man cracking nuts. His teeth were large and square, and they had a metallic gleam. They made short work of the gneiss. Dizelle flexed his fingers, selected another piece of the rock. "Among people," he observed, "this would be conspicuous. You are not adapted to get oxygen from quartz. We are." "You make Houdini look like a piker," Big John told him admiringly. I admit that's tougher cereal than I'd want to try, but the point of the gag still escapes me.
I am aware of that, said the strange man. You cannot comprehend because your mind is shackled, yet it must be evident that we are not too much alike. He rose to his feet. There is the matter of the body glow. I can control my body temperature, raising and lowering it as I choose. The greatest difficulty when I am among people is to keep it down to human body heat. Normally it is very much higher than yours, and when, due to exercise and metabolic speed-up, excess energy is accumulated, it is satisfying to us to radiate it. You get the same release by deep sighs, by long breaths, by stretching your limbs. Unfortunately, when we radiate rapidly in air, we glow. It has made us conspicuous.
We all have our hobbies, said Evers, shifting his swollen ankle and wincing. Did you ever hear of the Liars Club? If you like to hold office, you could be president.
Dizelle did not appear offended. I said you would not believe. When it is again my turn to explore, I will search for your Liars Club. I can see from your thoughts that it is concerned with jokes, and this is the one thing about you that we have not mastered. Other explorers have also felt baffled. The function of odd misstatement escapes us.
Other explorers? Evers' voice lost its note of ridicule, and Drinkard leaned forward with new interest. You mean there are a lot of incandescent guys like you prowling about?
Dizelle shrugged. All are not from my environment. Many are so unlike you that they cannot mingle, and so must observe from hiding. Others cannot exist in your atmosphere without artificial help. We contact them constantly. Your unawareness is a marvel to us all. For creatures so well supplied with adaptations for sensation, you are indeed blind.
Chuck Evers drew a long breath. If I could radiate, I'd be lit up like a theater marquee. You sound like an old professor I had once. I didn't understand him either.
Had Dizelle comprehended humor, he would have smiled, but he simply turned away with finality. Dizor is waiting by the glacier, he said. We have plans for this time. When you return to the settlements below, it would perhaps be wisest not to attempt to explain the lights. The next instant he was gone without a sound. The two young men sat silently by the dying fire. A few minutes later, both looked up, as though by signal, toward the upper reaches of the glacier. Two glowing spots, dull cherry red, moved steadily across the ice. They were visible for brief minutes, then slowly faded. Chuck Evers shifted restlessly. He shook his head as though a bee were buzzing inside it.
Did you hear something? He asked.
Not with my ears, said Drinkard, but as plain as a voice. Dizelle just said to my brain, "Good luck, boys, and good American."
Now I know I'm nuts, grunted Chuck Evers. That's what he said to me.
To descend Precipice Peak, even if only from Bighorn Glacier, is no fit task for a cripple. Still, Evers and Drinkard knew it had to be done, so in the early morning they set about it without haste and without complaint. When the going allowed it, Big John simply backpacked Evers. They made use of every ledge, for Chuck could rappel himself down spots he could not climb or be carried. Both were mountain men and tough, but by mid-afternoon they knew they had had enough. So nothing had ever looked better than the cheerful figure of Hein Kolb, slouched in the saddle of his dainty-footed pinto mare, and leading two pack-horses loaded with fish panniers. The ranger was headed down.
"The complete Samaritan, that's me," said Hein. "I haul a fish up and pour fish down. 2 loads for the price of 1. "We'll accept your insults along with the ride," Chuck Evers said warily. "I never knew what a pretty thing a horse could be."
Hein dropped his fish cans, helped to hoist Evers onto one of the pack-horses. Drinkard climbed aboard the other.
"What happened?" asked the ranger. "I saw by the headquarters record that you were going up."
Evers shrugged, and John Drinkard said, "The boy here was playing rock chuck on the stretch below the glacier, and one rolled with him." Evers grinned wryly, and John added, "It could happen to anybody, but it's the kind of thing that's partial to tenderfeet."
"Next time," said Evers humbly, "just leave me up there. I ain't worth saving."
They stopped only once. At the big switchback, John Drinkard swung from his horse, pried up a stone, tossed the tobacco can to Evers without a word. The ranger only raised his eyebrows. Back at their tent camp on the lake shore, Evers and Drinkard were not disturbed by questions.
When men fail on the peaks, they tell their own stories in their own time. Chuck's ankle showed quick improvement, and in a couple of days he was hobbling about. Only young Royston came to visit. "You have not been back to the lodge," he said. "Perhaps you are afraid to show your faces." "People talk your arm off up there," said Drinkard. He grinned at the pale young man. "Not many of 'em have the gall to come snooping down here." Royston sat composedly on a boulder. "You cannot offend me. I was concerned for you. I was interested, so I came. Did you see the lights?" "Nary a light," said Chuck cheerfully. He sat in a canvas chair with his foot propped up. "I told you they wouldn't show when anybody was up there." Drinkard turned on him. "You collected $5 from me by being on the other side of the fence. You were the man who was sure there would be some sign." Royston looked at them with pale eyes. "You are both muddling the waters, and you are both lying. There were lights on the peak when you were there, and I have a feeling you saw them. They were quite a show from here." "Then this is the place to see them from," said Chuck. "Closer up, you lose perspective." Royston rose from his seat on the rock. "Friendship means nothing to you, so I will take my small hike back to the lodge again. Actually, I came to say that tomorrow I leave this miserable place and go home. I have endured all the health I can stand." "Now that," said Chuck, "is a different story. We're sorry to see you go, fella." "Our regards to the swamps," John Drinkard put in. 10 to 1, when you get there, you'll wish you were back. Carl Royston showed his big teeth in a mirthless smile. "This," he said, "I very much doubt." They watched him go around the turn in the trail. Then Drinkard took 2 strides to the rock where Royston had sat. He touched a finger tentatively to the stone and snatched it away. "I thought so," he said. He really liked us, but this time he was careful not to shake hands. In spite of himself, he has reached his limit of control. His temperature is going up. Evers looked on with puzzled eyes. "He never could see a joke, and he'd wait to pick our brains for a new word," Drinkard pointed out. "Royston?" "Is a name out of a hat," said John Drinkard. "When that lad really goes home, he'll go with his buddies up there on the peak. I wonder which he is, Dezin or Dezette." End of The Light on Precipice Peak by Stephen Tall.
The Fifth Dimension by Claire Winger Harris. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anita Hibbard. The Fifth Dimension by Claire Winger Harris. "Why, this has happened before," I cried as I poured my husband a 3rd cup of coffee. John laid down the morning paper and shrieked with laughter. "I'll say it has, and it's liable to happen again tomorrow morning. Did you ever know me to drink fewer than 3 cups of coffee at breakfast, Helen?" "Oh, you don't know what I mean," I responded, a trifle irritably. "I've reference to that feeling that we all have occasionally, that the identical set of circumstances that surround us has existed before in some remote eon of time." "Fiddlesticks," ejaculated John, as he set down his empty coffee cup and folded his napkin. "I'm going to get my car started, as it takes so long these cold mornings." In which unsympathetic mood, he donned hat and overcoat and disappeared through the kitchen door. A second later, his head was thrust through the reopened door, and a jovial smile spread over his features. "Say, Ellen, it strikes me as I go out to get the old bus that this has happened before," he called back to me. "Something else will strike you," I cried playfully, picking up an empty cup. He dodged in mock consternation. Then his face grew earnest. "But seriously, my dear girl," he said, "I hope you aren't getting to believe in all that rot about soul transmigration. Surely you don't think your personality has been previously decked in other corporeal trappings, do you?" "No," I replied. "I do not believe that. I have always been myself, and you will always be yourself, stubborn as ever. My explanation of the oft-repeated phenomenon that my life has been lived before exactly as I live it now lies solely in the theory that time, which is the 4th dimension, is, like space, curved, and travels in great cycles. you cannot conceive of either the end of space or time. The law of the universe, as illustrated by the movements of the stars and planets, and the endless motion of the molecules and atoms, and the whirling of the electrons, proves that orbital motion is a cosmic law, and that all things return eventually to their starting point. And so, in the vast cycles of time and space, we repeat our existence upon this earth. And I claim that occasionally a fleeting memory of previous cycles thrusts itself into our consciousness. "Too deep for me," said John with a shrug. "I must get down to the office. And, by the way, an apple pie for dinner tonight would be greatly appreciated. I haven't had any for a long time." "Do you like my apple pies, John?" I asked, smiling. "Do I? You're an expert at it." "I suppose," he added, as he all but disappeared through the crack of the door, as it stood slightly ajar, "the infinite number of times that you have baked apple pies in previous cycles of existence has made you adept in that line." The door closed, and he was gone. Dear John. Of course he understood the theory as well as I did, but he was forced out among associates in the business world, and it was essential that his mind be continually occupied with the practical affairs of life. Dreamers might be vouchsafed glimpses of the truth, but did such visions always prove beneficial? There was no doubting that John was a greater success in life than I, whether he grasped the significance of certain cosmic truths or not. After all, I mused, the difference between the great and the small, the infinite and the finite, right and wrong, good and evil, is sometimes one of degree and not of quality. The most difficult is simple if we follow the rules. The people who make a muddle of their lives have deliberately, though unknowingly, chosen the harder way. They are lawbreakers, not necessarily in our legal sense, but they are transgressors of universal law. Had they simply worked in harmony with the law, success would have come easily. I have not always worked in harmony with the law, I thought. None of us have. Do I, now in this cycle of time, possess the ability to change errors performed in previous eons? Or am I a mere puppet, destined to a certain definite course of action throughout eternity? Was Henley right or wrong when he wrote, "I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul"? I believed in the cycle theory of time, and yet in it I saw no hope for changing the errors of the past. My theory was a death blow to progress and evolution. I had just slipped my last pie into the oven and glanced casually out of the kitchen window when I spied my neighbor, Mrs. Maxwell, on her cinder path between our house and the garage. Suddenly, I had the same sensation that I had experienced at breakfast. This has happened before. I know it. Then, like a flash, before a seeming darkness obliterated my fleeting memory, came the warning to my consciousness that Mrs. Maxwell ought not to enter her garage. I took a step toward the door with the intention of calling to Mrs. Maxwell. There was plenty of time. The path was long, and she was not a third of the way to the garage. I watched her, my heart thumping wildly. She had stopped to pick up a scrap of paper. I took another step toward the door, then paused. "Oh, what's the use?" I argued. "She'd think I was crazy to run out there and attempt to keep her from her errand to her garage. I wonder why I have had two sensations of this memory enigma today. Often they are weeks, even months apart." Resolutely, I turned and left the kitchen, intending to finish my remaining housework. I reached the first landing of the stairs when the sound of an explosion that rocked the house to its foundation caused me to start in wild-eyed terror. In a panic of fearful premonition, I rushed to a south window. The Maxwell garage was a mass of roaring flames. "It is fate, fate," I groaned in my anguish. "There is no hope. We mortals cannot escape. The cycles of life, like the wheels of the ancient juggernaut, ruthlessly grind us to our destruction, and there is no hope." It seemed that for months after Mrs. Maxwell's funeral, I could not rise above a sense of despondency. A hopelessness was ever present in my consciousness, and nothing I did seemed worth the effort. Finally realizing that my present mental state must not continue, I plunged into domestic and social duties with a vim that was most unusual for me. Not once during many months following the Maxwell tragedy had I experienced a single recurrence of my unaccountable memory flashes. Then, one day, the sensation returned. John was ready to make a business trip to the south and had purchased his railroad ticket early in the afternoon. The train was scheduled to leave town at 8:15 p.m. The supper dishes had just been cleared away, and John had hurried upstairs to pack his grip, when the feeling that this had all happened before came upon me, more realistically than I had ever before experienced it, and this time it was accompanied by a premonition of the same nature as that which had warned me of Mrs. Maxwell's fatal trip to her garage. I lost no time in hurrying up to John's room, where I found him sorting over the things to take with him on his trip. "John, don't go this evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There is a morning train at 11:53. Can't you take that instead of going tonight?" My husband carefully tucked his hairbrush into his satchel, and for a moment deigned me no reply. "I'm afraid to have you go tonight, John," I continued. "I've had a sort of warning. You know what I mean." John closed and locked his grip. "Are you afraid here alone?" he asked, after what seemed an interminable silence. "No, it's not for myself that I fear danger, but for you. Won't you defer your trip?" I persisted. "Now, see here, Ellen," John responded with a show of irritation. "I've already bought my ticket and laid my plans for meeting Hopkins in Atlanta on Friday, and I can't and won't stop because of some fool notion of yours. I had supposed you'd forgotten about this fourth dimension time cycle business." He picked up his satchel. "But whether you've forgotten it or not, the 8:15 sees me ensconced on my way to Georgia." "But, John, dear," I cried in desperation, "remember the Maxwell affair. If I had only obeyed my impulse to rush out and warn poor Mrs. Maxwell, she would be living now." John paused and looked at me as if considering, but it was only for a second. Then he resumed his descent of the stairs. "No," he said, "I've got to be in Atlanta on Friday or stand a chance of losing one of the biggest orders we've had in months." Then it seemed as though something snapped in my brain, and I heard my voice as though it were another's coming from a distance. "The juggernaut, fate, grinds mortals beneath its wheels, and there is no hope." I soon became conscious of the fact that I was sobbing hysterically and that John was holding me in his arms. "Ellen, Ellen," his dear voice was saying, "I'm going to fool fate a trick and let Hopkins wait. I leave tomorrow at 11:53. Let's see what's on the radio for the rest of the evening." I gazed up at him with incredulity. "Oh, John," I cried ecstatically, "do you think we can prove that the cycles of time are not inexorable?" "We can at least give the theory a fair trial," he said, smiling. I poured John his third cup of coffee, but did not feel that it had happened before. A mild thump on the front porch informed me that the morning paper had arrived. I brought it in and laid it in front of John. Then I fled to the kitchen, where the odor of burning toast apprised me of the fact that I was much needed. Returning with the scraped toast, I seated myself opposite John for the purpose of resuming my breakfast. "What news?" I asked casually. For answer, John handed me the paper and pointed mutely to an enormous headline. His face was ashen, and his hand trembled. With a sinking sensation, I read the large letters. "Head-on collision demolishes engines and cars and kills 70 persons." "John," I gasped, was it the 8:15? His voice was husky, with pent emotion. "Ellen, it was the 8:15, and I have been on it in the other cycles of time. I know it now." I gazed at him incredulously for a moment, and then, half in fun, half seriously, I said, "John, you are now living on borrowed time." He smiled a little wanly. "Not exactly that, dear," he said, "but my mind has been doing some rapid thinking since I saw those headlines, And I believe I have a solution to your ever-puzzling problem of the fourth dimension, time. If you can prove my time cycles are not incompatible with progress, evolution, and growth, I cried eagerly, you will make me the happiest woman on earth. Wouldn't a new fur coat delight you more? He asked teasingly. Well, that would help some, I admitted. But tell me, what makes you believe that evolution and progress are in fact, despite the eon-worn ruts of the cycle of time? The fifth dimension, he replied in a quiet voice. The fifth dimension? I echoed, puzzled. Which is simply this, Ellen. There is a general progression of the universe over and above the cycles of time, which renders each cycle a little in advance of the previous one. We see and recognize this truth daily in the phenomena of humanity. Every baby born starts life a little in advance, materially and mentally, of its father. This process is very slow, and we call it evolution, but it is a perceptible progress nevertheless. It may be aptly likened to the whirls of a spring as compared to a mere flat coil of wire. The Earth follows an orbit around the Sun, and every year it is in the same relative position with regard to the Sun as it was the previous year. It has completed one of its countless cycles, but you know as well as I do that the Sun and the Earth, as well as the other planets, are all farther along in space together. There is a general progression of 12 miles a second on some vaster orbit. This general progression, then, is analogous to our possibility of change and growth, the power to better our conditions. In other words, it is a fifth dimension. The wheels of the juggernaut can be turned aside, I said reverently, and there is hope. End of The Fifth Dimension by Claire Winger Harris.
Security by Bryce Walton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tom Shoesmith. Security by Bryce Walton. If secrecy can be carried to the brink of madness, what can happen when imprisonment and time are added to super-secrecy? We, Sam Lewis thought as he lay in the dark trying to sober up, are the living dead. It was a death without honor. It was a death of dusty, sterile stupidity. It was wretched, shameful, a human waste, and far too ridiculous a business to bear any longer. The hell with the war. The hell with the government. The hell with the secret Project X, Y, Z, or D, or whatever infantile code letter identified the legalized tomb in which Sam and the others had been incarcerated too long. He flung his hand around in the dark in a gesture of self-contempt, and his hand found the soft contours of a woman's breast. Her warm body moved, sighed beside him as he turned his head and stared at the dim outline of Professor Betty Seaton's oval face, soft and unharried in sleep. Unharried and unmarried, he thought. Good God. He detached his hand, slipped out of bed and stood in the middle of the floor, found his nylon coverall and sandals, dressed silently, and opened the door to get out of Betty's apartment, but fast. He glanced back, his face hot with bitterness and his mouth twisting with disgust. As she moved slightly, and he knew she was awake and looking at him. "Darling," she said thickly, "don't go." She was awake, but still drifting in the euphoria of VAT 69. He felt both sad and very mean. Then he shut the door behind him, ran out into the desert night. The line of camouflage barracks on one side, the grounds including the lab buildings, all loomed up darkly under the starlight. He took a deep breath. Now, he asked himself, have you the guts to get out, tell them off, make the gesture? It won't do any good. No one else will care or understand. They're too numb and resigned. You'll never get past the fence. The guards will haul you into the wards and work you over. They'll work over what's left, until what's left won't be worth carrying over to the incinerator with the other garbage in the morning. You'll be brainwashed and cleared until you're on mental rock bottom and won't even know what direction up is. And you won't give a damn. But don't you have the guts even to make the gesture, just for the sake of what's left of your integrity, before they dim down your futile brain cells to a faint glow of final and perpetual mediocrity? Betty and he had clung to some integrity, had made a point of not getting too intimate, a kind of challenge, a holdout against the decadence of the project, what was left now of any self-respect. A security guard with his white helmet and his white leather harness and his stun gun sauntered by, and Lewis ducked into the shadows beside the barracks. His heart skipped several thumps as the guard passed, looked at the entrance to Betty's apartment. Maybe someone had reported his liaison with Betty. Beautiful and desirable as she was, and as much as he wanted to marry her, he had not been able to marry Betty Seaton. If the war ever ended, if the security curtain was ever lifted, if they were ever let out of compulsive government employment, then they would get married. That was what they had kept telling one another during quick, secret meetings. If. Somewhere along the trail of this last alcoholic binge, one or both of them had abandoned what they had both considered an important tradition. It wasn't much, but they had clung to it against temptation, knowing that once they gave in, it wasn't much further to the bottom of Skid Hill. Betty Seaton had been a world-famous physicist. Sam Lewis had been a top-rate atomics engineer. And what are we now? He thought, watching the guard, except just a couple of alky bums looking for a few extra kicks to keep us from admitting we're dead. A request for a marriage license had never been answered. Betty Seaton did not have Q clearance for some reason. Sam had full clearance and worked in the pit, the highest Q security section in the project. And never the twain could meet. If their little tryst was discovered, Betty Seaton would be taken to the mental wards and cleared, a polite term for having any security info you might have picked up, cleaned out of your brain along with a great many other characteristics that made you a distinct personality. It was just one of those necessary evils. It had to be done for security. Psychological murder in the name of security. The guard walked on and disappeared around the corner of the end barracks building. Lewis started walking aimlessly in the dark, up and down in front of the barracks, past the blacked-out windows and doors and the shadowy hulks of the lab buildings, and beyond that the camouflaged entrances to other subterranean labs, the synthetic food plants, the stores and supplies. The project was self-sustaining, in complete, secure, and sterile isolation from the world, from all of humanity. He headed for Professor Melvin Lanier's apartment. Tonight the big party was at Lanier's. There was a drunken brawl going on all the time at someone's apartment. There was nothing else to do. Liquor, tranquilizing drugs, wife-swapping, dope addiction, dream pills, sleeping tablets, and that was it. That was what the project had come to. Experimental work at the project had wobbled to a dead end. Only the pathetic and meaningless motions remained. Still, he thought, as he walked in through the open door of Lanier's apartment, there is a war on. H-bombs and A-bombs outlawed, but anything less than that was sporting. He wanted to do what he could, but he was squelched, just as everyone else here was smothered and rendered useless by regulations and a government of complete and absolute secrecy carried to its ultimate stupid denominator in the hands of political and military incompetence. Still, there is a war on, he thought again as he walked into the big living room filled with artificial light and even more artificial laughter. Was it possible to do something, just some little thing, to shake loose this caged brain? A few more drinks, he thought, will help me reach another completely indecisive decision. In another 2 hours he would have to report back to the pit. No reason for it now. It was just his job, his patriotic duty. Progress in nuclear developments and reactor technology in the pit had ground to a dismal halt for him over 7 months ago. Yes, no doubt about it, he needed a few more shots to make it palatable for a while longer, his standing membership in the Walking Dead. Through shadows in the garden, shapes wavered about drunkenly to the throb of hi-fi. Lewis went to the robotic barkeep and started drinking. This time, however, he didn't feel any effects. He stood looking around, ashamed, made sicker by what he saw, some of the world's finest minds, top scientists, reduced to shallow, burbling buffoons. Dave Nemerov, Nobel Prize winner in physics, weaved up to Sam and looked at him out of bleary eyes. "Hi, Sammy. All full of gloom again, boy?" Nemerov, a chubby little man dressed in shorts and nothing else, frowned with drunken exaggeration. "Easy does it, Sammy. You might find the security boys giving you a lobotomy rap." A drop of sweat ran down the side of Lewis's high-boned cheek. "Well, what's the great physicist been doing for his country?" Lewis asked. He knew that Nemerov hadn't even been in his lab for over a month. He even remembered when Nemerov had griped about the shortage of technically trained personnel, the policy of secrecy that clouded, divided, and obstructed his work, hampered his research until it finally was no longer worth the struggle. His story was the story of everyone in the project. He couldn't get information from other departments and projects because of secrecy. They were all cut off from one another. No information was ever released from the restricted list. Most important documents were secret and had remained out of reach. The only declassified documents available in the project were grade school stuff that everybody had known 20 years ago. For an instant, Nemerov appeared almost sober and completely saddened. "I've forgotten what I was working on," Nemerov said. "Have another drink, then," Lewis said, "and you'll forget you've forgotten." They clinked glasses. "Smile, Sammy," Nemerov said. "It can't last forever. We'll soon get the word. The war will be over." "What war?" Lewis whispered. "Shh, Sammy, for God's sake." Nemerov moistened his lips and looked around, but there weren't any guards at the party. There never were. The guards had a barracks of their own in the commander's private sector. They never talked to civilians. They never attended parties. They kept strictly to themselves, and so did the commander. For almost a year now, as far as Lewis knew, no civilian in the project had even seen the commander. His reports were issued daily. Occasionally his voice was heard on the intercom. "Wonder who's winning the war out there," Lewis said to no one in particular. He thought of Betty. Some whiskey spilled from the shot glass. "I wish you would shut up," Nemerov said hoarsely. It still seemed incredible to Lewis that the military psychologists had decided among themselves that for the sake of security, all intercommunication between the project and the outside was to be cut off. No news, no television, no radio, no nothing. For security, and also on the theory that scientists could work better completely cloistered up like medieval monks. Not even a phone call. Absolute 100% isolation. Legalized catatonia. They had choked this project to death, and he wondered how many others were dead and where they were. He didn't know where this project was, except it was on the desert. He didn't even know for sure what desert. He had been drugged when he was brought here 2 years ago. For security, you know. Nemerov never mentioned his wife and kids anymore. From the behavior of Nemerov and most of the others, you'd think the outside no longer existed. Cardoza, the cybernetic genius, came up, his eyes glazed with the effects of some new narcotic that Oliver Dutton, world-renowned biochemist, had cooked up for want of anything better to do. The wives of 2 other scientists hung on Cardoza's arms, their bodies mostly bare, their eyes dull as they wandered about the room like radar for the promise of some emotional oasis in the wasteland. "How you fellows like my robotic barkeep?" Cardoza yelled. "Pours a nice glass of whiskey," Lewis said. "This is only the beginning," Cardoza said, his mouth glistening and wet under his hopped-up eyes. "That barkeep's a perfect servant and can never make a mistake. Spent the last year building it. It can mix anything." "It'll practically win the war for us," Lewis said. Nemirov wiped at his sweating face. The two straying wives stared dumbly. Cardoza winced. "Don't be cutting, my friend," he said to Lewis. His mouth turned down at the corners. "I tried, just as the rest of us tried. To go on and develop what I was sent here to develop, I need Q clearance. I can't get it, because when the war started, I wasn't a citizen. Is that clear, Lewis?" "Forget it," Lewis said. "That's what I intend to keep on doing," Cardoza said. "Meanwhile, my little robotic barkeep is only the beginning. I'm working on other, even more ingenious automata. One will do card tricks, another's a tight-wire artist, and one can even tell fortunes." "How about one that can drag humans out of a hat?" Lewis asked. "Come on, ladies," Cardoza said as he moved away. "Let's go play Dr. McWilliam's new QX game." "Oh," one of the wives said, giggling. "Something new?" "Yeah," Lewis said to her, thinking of the fact that at one time, long ago and far away, McWilliams had been working on a theory supposed to have been aimed far beyond Einstein. McWilliams' new mathematical game. This one's also played in the dark. Mixed couples, of course. QX, the big mathematical discovery of the age. People get lost in pairs, and later in the dark they add up to bigger numbers. Lewis shoved off from the bar and walked toward the far corner of the garden where he saw old Shelby Stenger, the great atomics expert, flat on his belly, lying in the moonlight with fountain water misting his face, snoring like a tired old dog, with a little thread of drool hanging out of the corner of his mouth. Mac Brogarth, nuclear physicist, came waltzing grotesquely across the garden and toppled backward into the pool under the fountain, and lay there too weak even to raise his head out of the water. He would have drowned if Lewis hadn't lifted it out for him. The old man in Lewis's arms looked up at Lewis, with a passing light of tragic sobriety. "Sam Lewis," he said. "That's you, isn't it, Sam? I had a cabin up near Lake Michigan, and I was going up there to finish important work. I'll never get back there, Sam. I know now I never will. I never will." Lewis stood up. Without seeing or hearing anyone, he walked out into the dry coolness of the starlit desert night. He walked between the barracks, past the mess hall toward the labs, turned down the length of that ominous-looking hulk which concealed the pit, and the monster with which Lewis had worked until there was no use working any more. Beyond that he saw the electric fence and the white helmeted guards standing at rigid attention. He walked over there, his shoes crunching on sand and gravel, and looked into the guard's face. It was a mask, expressionless and rigid. Its eyes were hardly human, Lewis thought. It had many of the characteristics of Cardoza's robotic barkeep. Lewis knew that the security guards had been worked over in the wards until there was no possibility of there being security risks. Any classified thought, even if it penetrated one side of their heads, quickly drained through the sieved brain and out the other side. "Carry on, soldier," Lewis said. The guard didn't seem to hear. Lewis walked back toward the lab building covering the pit. The conflict was like a knife, slicing him apart inside. What if he made a grandstand gesture now? It would be much worse, perhaps, than merely being sent into the wards for a little mental working over. He'd be found guilty of sabotage, tried by the commander's kangaroo court-martial, found guilty of being a traitor to his country, a foreign agent. Probably he'd be placed inside a gas chamber on a stool, and a little gas pellet would be dropped on his lap. And anyway, aside from his own punishment, would it be morally right? Maybe I'm the one who's crazy, he thought. Maybe it's hell out there, reduced to God knew what kind of social chaos. Maybe we're about to win. Maybe we're about to lose. Maybe as bad as it is, it's the best one could expect during the greatest crisis. He went inside. and took the elevator down one floor into the lead-lined pit. He walked up to the control panel and looked through the thick layers of shielding, transparent teflonite into the pit, watching the monster indirectly through the big lenticular screen disc above the control panel. The monster stood in the lead-lined pit, inactive, as it had been inactive for months. And even before that, during the months when Lewis was learning to control the monster, until it seemed an extension of his own nervous system, its work had become useless, due to unobtainable documents and personnel, not to mention lack of communication with other research centers. The monster was part of a general plan to compensate for the outlawing of A and H bombs, the most deadly conceivable compromise. The pit was a deadly sea of radioactivity in which only a mechanical robot monster could work. Outside the pit, Lewis directed the monster, whose duty was the construction of drone planes. A few had been built, but they weren't quite effective, and now it was impossible to go on with the experimentation. The parts were all there. Everything was there, except certain vital classified documents that could not be cleared into this particular project. Thousands of drone planes were to have been built, and perhaps were being built in some other project, but not in this one. Thousands of drone planes with raw, unshielded atomic engines, light and inordinately powerful with an indefinite cruising range, remote-controlled, free of fallible human agency, loaded with bacteriological bombs, the terrible gas known as the G-agent, and in addition loaded spray tanks that would spew deadly gamma rays and neutrons over limitless areas of atmosphere. Lewis moved his hands over the sensitive controls, and through the lenticular disc watched the monster respond with the delicate gestures of a gigantic violinist. The monster was a robot, 10 times bigger than Cardoza's barkeep, and when Lewis moved his hands, the monster moved its own huge mandibles as its electromagnum colloid brain picked up Lewis's mental directions. The monster was immune to radiation and bacteriological horrors. It swam in death as unconcerned as a lovely lady wallowed in a pink bubble bath. Lewis sat in the twilight of the pit, making the monster move about in its futile rounds. Lewis loved the monster, and felt the wasteful tragedy of its magnificent potential. A wonder of the world, a reaffirmation of man's imagination and his powers of reason. The monster was built for what might seem horribly destructive ends, but its potential was for limitless achievement of the best and most far-reaching in man. Yet here it was, doing nothing at all. Standing in a sea of radioactive poison, a gigantic symbol of man's stupidity to man. Could a man know the truth and continue to deny it, and still remain sane? You could go on living that way. You could take happy pills, sleeping pills, dream pills, and stay lushed up on government liquor. But sooner or later you would have to face the horrible empty waste. After that loomed the face of madness. And yet, Lewis thought, how do I know that I know the truth? I'm cut off. No info, no communication. For all I know, we're the only people left in the world, an oasis of secrecy surrounded by desert. Lewis walked back up to the first floor and out into the night, heading for Betty Seaton's apartment. Maybe she was sober enough now to talk this thing over. To hell with security regulations. Just the same, he walked along in the shadow next to the building to avoid any eyewitness of his proposed rendezvous. Science, he thought, was really another name for freedom. It couldn't function without freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry. You couldn't mix it up with security and cut off communication, because communication is the essence of science. An idea is universal, and how can you go on thinking when you're no longer part of the world? Whatever the decision arrived at in Lewis's own heart might otherwise have been, he was never to know. His decision was made for him by an hysterical laugh, the sound of scuffling on boards, and another laugh. He came around the corner of the barracks and saw the guard manhandling Betty Seaton down the steps of her apartment building. The guard was big, built like a wedge, with a flat bulldog face bunched up under his white helmet. The guard's brain had been carefully honed down to an efficient, completely unintelligent but precise fighting machine level. He neither knew nor cared why he did anything. But he was handicapped by having Betty Seaton in one hand. He was whirling, raising his stun gun with the other, when Lewis hit him. Lewis drove in with his weight behind first a solid long blow that broke a rigid wall of muscle in the guard's belly, turned it to soft clay. Betty fell free and lay laughing on the gravel. Her face was a white smear in the starlight. Lewis brought his knee up into the guard's face as he bent over, sank another one into the soft belly, kicked the guard in the crotch, stamped on his booted foot, came back and ran forward again, driving his shoulder again into the guard's belly. The guard's feet hit the bottom step. He smashed into the boards, and his helmet flew off as his head thudded on the stanchion. The guard just shook his shaven head, started to get up heavily, reaching again for his stun gun, his face expressionless. Lewis heard footsteps pounding around the corner, slashing on gravel. More guards. Dehumanized and insensitive, they were almost as invulnerable as so many robots. He turned, ran past Betty Seaton, stilly lying there with only a thin housecoat around her, not laughing now, but looking suddenly sober and horrified. "Betty!" She stared up at him. A block away he could hear the guards coming, and he kept on running. He yelled back, "Get a jeep! Get Brogarth, Cardoza, Nemerov, anybody! We're breaking out of here!" "Where?" he heard her yelling after him as he went around the corner. He glanced back around the corner and saw the herd of mechanized human beings slogging toward him. "Near the gate," Lewis said. He ran toward the pit. He ran down the steps into the console room and looked into the lenticular disk where a ghostly blue radiance shadowed the walls. "We're going to do ourselves some good after all, monster," Lewis said tightly. He gripped the controls and sent the monster its last set of orders. It hurled tons of drone plane motors into the shielding walls, and its huge mandibles ripped open the shielding and peeled it away like a food canister. Smoke began to boil. Flames crackled in blue arcs. Steel beams crumbled like wax. Globs of concrete fell in a cloud of dust, swirling debris. Lewis grabbed the intercom, dialed the commander's office. No answer. He got through the exchange and got the commander's apartment. He heard a drunken whine, and behind that the drunken, depraved laughter of officers and their wives and the sound of bongo drums. "The monster's breaking out of the pit," Lewis said. "It's shooting out more than enough deadly radioactivity to kill all of you if you don't get the hell out and get out fast." "What? What's that?" "If you think I'm having a nightmare," Lewis continued, "take a look out the window, Commander." Lewis dropped the intercom. The monster could go quite a distance before it stopped, its remote control radius probably not exceeding 3 miles. The monster went out of the pit, taking walls and flooring with it. The entire structure trembled. Beams fell, ceilings crumbled, and the monster went through the smoking debris like a juggernaut. A guard lay crushed under a steel beam. Lewis took the stun gun from his hand and went up the debris-choked stairs. Outside he saw figures streaming out into the starlight and the lab buildings bursting into flames. He also saw the monster, glowing with bluish radiance, moving straight ahead toward the electric fence. The siren was screaming and howling. Shadows seemed to be streaming toward air raid shelters. That was all right. The security curtain was torn down. They could come back up later into the light and wonder what had happened and find out where they really were. Guards were running about like ugly toys, out of control, looking, listening for commands. Lewis ran through the thickening smoke and saw the jeep by the south gate. Betty was in it, together with Brogarth and Nemerov. "Hurry, hurry, run!" he heard Betty scream. The guard was cutting at an angle toward Lewis, between him and the jeep. Beyond the guard was a gaping hole in the fence, and on the other side of that he could see the gigantic, flickering nimbus of the monster still walking toward the east. Lewis kept running. 5 feet away he brought up the stun gun and shot the guard in the face. Lewis jumped under the wheel of the Jeep, slammed it into gear, and they headed down the concrete strip and straight for the gap in the fence. "What happened to Cardoza?" Lewis asked. Brogarth said from the back seat, "He said he didn't want to be labeled a security risk and be executed for sabotage." Nemerov was drunk, and he kept mumbling incoherently and sometimes giving out with bits and pieces of half-remembered poetry. About a mile out in the sand and next to a wall of sandstone, they waited for any signs of pursuit. There were none. They rested there until morning, only an hour and a half away, and when they looked back toward the location of the project, they could see nothing that looked any different from sand, brush, rocks, and red sandstone. "Perfect camouflage," Nemerov said as the Jeep started up again. "You could walk within 50 feet of that fence and never know there was any project there." Later a hot wind came up, and they ran into the monster lying dead on its face with dust devils dancing over it. An old prospector, leading a burro, came around the wall of sandstone and looked at the monster, then at the occupants of the Jeep. "Howdy, folks," he said. "Hello," Lewis said. "We're lost. Where are we, and which way do we go to get to civilization?" "What's that thing?" the prospector asked, looking at the monster. "A scientific experiment that was never finished," Lewis said. "That's what I figured," the prospector said. "You scientists out here are always up to something." He pointed to the right. "Keep going that way and you'll find a narrow road. Follow it and you'll hit the middle of the valley and a highway right into the Chocolate Mountains." Lewis knew where he was. The Chocolate Mountains walled off the rushing Colorado River from the Imperial Valley and Los Angeles farther on. "Thanks," Lewis said. "How's the war going these days?" Betty asked. The prospector scratched his head and replaced his felt hat. He looked at them oddly. "You must have been holed up in them hills a long time, miss. There ain't been any war for 2 years. They started one, but the first couple of days scared everybody too much and they called the whole thing off. Where you folks been, anyways? To the moon?" "Practically," Lewis said. As the Jeep moved away, Nemerov turned and looked back at the monster and the old prospector, who still stood there gazing at it. "My name," Nemerov said, "is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare the lone and level sands stretch far away." The End of Security by Bryce Walton.
Hot Planet by Hal Clement. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hot Planet by Hal Clement. 1. The wind, which had nearly turned the Albareo's landing into a disaster instead of a mathematical exercise, was still playing tunes about the fins and landing legs as Schlossberg made his way down to Deck 5. The noise didn't bother him particularly, though the endless seismic tremors made him dislike the ladders. But just now he was able to ignore both. He was curious, though not hopeful. "Is there anything at all obvious on the last set of tapes, Joe?" Mardikian, the geophysicist, shrugged. "Just what you'd expect on a planet which has at least one quake in each 50-mile square area every 5 minutes. You know yourself we had a nice seismic program set up, but when we touched down we found we couldn't carry it out. We've done our best with the natural tremors, incidentally stealing most of the record tapes the other projects would have used. We have a lot of nice information for the computers back home, but it will take all of them to make any sense out of it." Schlossberg nodded. The words had not been necessary. His astronomical program had been one of those sabotaged by the transfer of tapes to the seismic survey. "I just hoped," he said. "We each have an idea why Mercury developed an atmosphere during the last few decades, but I guess the high school kids on Earth will know whether it's right before we do. I'm resigned to living in a chess-type universe. Few and simple rules, but infinite combinations of them. But it would be nice to know an answer sometime." "So it would. As a matter of fact, I need to know a couple right now, from you. How close to finish are the other programs, or what's left of them?" "I'm all set," replied Schlossberg. "I have a couple of instruments still monitoring the sun just in case, but everything in the revised program is on tape." "Good. Tom, any use asking you?" The biologist grimaced. "I've been shown 216 different samples of rock and dust. I have examined in detail 12 crystal growths which look vaguely like vegetation. Nothing was alive or contained living things by any standards I could conscientiously set." Mardikian's gesture might have meant sympathy. "Camille, I may as well stop now as any time. I'll never be through. Tape didn't make much difference to me, but I wish I knew what weight of specimens I could take home. Eileen?" Mardikian's glance at the stratigrapher took the place of the actual question. "Cam speaks for me, except that I could have used any more tape you could have spared. What I have is gone." "All right, that leaves me, the tape thief. The last spools are in the seismographs now and will start running out in 17 hours. The tractors will start out on their last rounds in 16 and should be back in roughly a week. Will, does that give you enough to figure the weights we rockhounds can have on the return trip?" The Albareo's captain nodded. "Close enough. There hasn't really been much question since it became evident we'd find nothing for the mass tanks here. I'll have a really precise check in an hour, but I can tell right now you have about 1.5 metric tons to split up among the three of you. Ideal departure time is 310 hours away, as you all know. We can stay here until then, or go into a parking and survey orbit at almost any time before then. You have all the survey you need, I should think, from the other time, but suit yourselves." "I'd just as soon be spacesick as seasick," remarked Camille Burkett. "I still hate to think that the entire planet is as shivery as the spot we picked." Willard Rosen smiled. "You researchers told me where to land after 10 days in orbit mapping this rock ball. I set you just where you asked. If you'd found even 5 tons of juice we could use in the reaction tanks, I could still take you to another one, if you could agree which one. I hate to say don't blame me, but I can't think of anything else that fits. So we sit until the last of the tractors is back with the precious seismo tapes playing Battleship while our back teeth are being shaken out by earthquakes? Excuse the word? What a thrill! Glorious adventure!" Zeno, the communications specialist who had been out of a job almost constantly since the landing, spoke sourly. The captain was the only one who saw fit to answer. "If you want adventure, you made a mistake exploring space. The only space adventures I've heard of are second-hand stories built on guesswork. The people who really had them weren't around to tell about it. Unless Dr. Marini discovers a set of Mercurian monsters at the last minute and they invade the ship or cut off one of the tractors, I'm afraid you'll have to do without adventures." Zeno grimaced. "That sounds funny coming from a spaceman, Captain. I didn't really mean adventure, though. All I want is something to do besides betting whether the next quake will come in 1 minute or 5. I haven't even had to fix a suit radio since we touched down. How about my going out with one of the tractors on this last trip at least?" "It's all right with me," replied Rosen. "But Dr. Mardikian runs the professional part of this operation. I require that Spur, Trackman, Hargadon, and Aiello go as drivers, since without them even a minor mechanical problem would be more than an adventure. As I recall it, Dr. Harmon, Dr. Schlossberg, Dr. Marini, and Dr. Mardikian are scheduled to go. But if any one of them is willing to let you take his or her place, I certainly don't mind." The radio man looked around hopefully. The geologist and the biologist shook their heads negatively, firmly and unanimously. But the astronomer pondered for a moment. Zeno watched tensely. "It may be all right," Schlossberg said at last. "What I want to get is a set of wind, gas pressure, gas temperature, and gas composition measures around the route. I didn't expect to be more meteorologist than astronomer when we left Earth, and didn't have exactly the right equipment. Hargadon and Aiello helped me improvise some, and this is the first chance to use it on dark side. If you can learn what has to be done with it before starting time, though, you're welcome to my place." The communicator got to his feet fast enough to leave the deck in Mercury's feeble gravity. "Lead me to it, Doc. I guess I can learn to read a homemade weather vane." "Is that merely bragging or a challenge?" drawled a voice which had not previously joined the discussion. Zeno flushed a bit. "Sorry, Luigi," he said hastily. "I didn't mean it just that way, but I still think I can run the stuff." "Likely enough," Aiello replied. "Remember, though, it wasn't made just for talking into." Schlossberg, now on his feet, cut in quickly. "Come on, Arnie. We'll have to suit up to see the equipment. It's outside." He shepherded the radio man to the hatch at one side of the deck and shooed him down toward the engine and airlock levels. Both were silent for some moments, but safely out of earshot of Deck 5, the younger man looked up and spoke. "You needn't push, Doc. I wasn't going to make anything of it. Luigi was right, and I asked for it." The astronomer slowed a bit in his descent. "I wasn't really worried," he replied. "But we have several months yet before we can get away from each other, and I don't like talk that could set up grudges. Matter of fact, I'm even a little uneasy about having the girls along, though I'm no misogynist." "Girls? They're not—" "There goes your foot again. Even Harmon is about 10 years older than you, I suppose. But they're girls to me. What's more important, they no doubt think of themselves as girls." "Even Dr. Burkett? That is, I mean—" "Even Dr. Burkett. Here, get into your suit. And maybe you'd better take out the mic. It'll be enough if you can listen for the next hour or two." Zeno made no answer, suspecting with some justice that anything he said would be wrong. Each made final checks on the other's suit. Then they descended one more level to the airlock. This occupied part of the same deck as the fusion plants, below the wings and reaction mass tanks, but above the main engine. Its outer door was just barely big enough to admit a spacesuited person. Even with the low air pressure carried by spaceships, a large door area meant large total force on jam, hinges, and locks. It opened onto a small balcony from which a ladder led to the ground. The two men paused on the balcony to look over the landscape. This hadn't changed noticeably since the last time either had been out, though there might have been some small difference in the volcanic cones a couple miles away to the northeast. The furrows down the sides of these, which looked as though they had been cut by water but were actually bone-dry ash slides, were always undergoing alteration as gas from below kept blowing fresh scoria fragments out of the craters. The spines, steep, jagged fragments of rock which thrust upward from the plain beyond and to both sides of the cones, seemed dead as ever. The level surface between the Albareo and the cones was more interesting. Mardikian and Schlossberg believed it to be a lava sheet dating from early in Mercury's history, when more volatile substances still existed in the surface rocks to cut down their viscosity when molten. They supposed that much, perhaps most, of the surface around the twilight belt had been flooded by this very liquid lava, which had cooled to a smoother surface than most earthly lava flows. How long it had stayed cool, they didn't guess. But both men felt sure that Mercury must have periodic upheavals as heat accumulated inside it. Heat coming not from radioactivity, but from tidal energy. Mercury's orbit is highly eccentric. At perihelion, tidal forces try to pull it apart along the planet-to-sun line, while at aphelion, the tidal force is less and the little world's own gravity tries to bring it back to a spherical shape. The real change in form is not great, but a large force working through even a small amount of distance can mean a good deal of energy. If the energy can't leak out, and Mercury's rocks conduct heat no better than those of Earth, the temperature must rise. Sooner or later, the men argued, deeply buried rock must fuse to magma. Its liquefaction would let the bulk of the planet give further under tidal stress, so heat would be generated even faster. Eventually, a girdle of magma would have to form far below the crust all around the twilight strip, where the tidal strain would be greatest. Sooner or later, this would melt its way to the surface, giving the zone a period of intense volcanic activity, and incidentally, giving the planet a temporary atmosphere. The idea was reasonable. It had, the astronomer admitted, been suggested long before to account for supposed volcanism on the moon. It justified the careful examination that Schlossberg and Zeno gave the plane before they descended the ladder, for it made reasonable the occasional changes which were observed to occur in the pattern of cracks weaving over its surface. No one was certain just how permanent the local surface was, though no one could really justify feeling safer on board the Albareo than outside on the lava. If anything really drastic happened, the ship would be no protection. The sun, hanging just above the horizon slightly to the watcher's right, cast long shadows which made the cracks stand out clearly. As far as either man could see, nothing had changed recently. They descended the ladder carefully. Even the best designed spacesuits are somewhat vulnerable, and made their way to the spot where the tractors were parked. A sheet metal fence 12 feet high and 4 times as long provided shade, which was more than a luxury this close to the sun. The tractors were parked in this shadow, and beside and between them were piles of equipment and specimens. The apparatus Schlossberg had devised was beside the tractor to the north end of the line, just inside the shaded area. It was still just inside the shade when they finished, 4 hours later. Hargadon had joined them during the final hour and helped pack the equipment in the tractor he was to drive. Zeno had had no trouble in learning to make the observations Schlossberg wanted, and the youngster was almost unbearably cocky. Schlossberg hoped, as they returned to the Albareo, that no one would murder the communications expert in the next 12 hours. There would be nothing to worry about after the trip started. Hargadon was quite able to keep anyone in his place without being nasty about it. If Zeno had been going with Aiello or Harmon, but he wasn't, and it was pointless to dream up trouble. And no trouble developed all by itself. Part 2. Zeno was not only still alive, but still reasonably popular when the first of the tractors set out, carrying Eileen Harmon and Eric Trackman, the Albareo's nuclear engineer. It started more than an hour before the others, since the stratigrapher's drilling program, done or not, took extra time. The tractor hummed off to the south, since both dark side routes required a long detour to pass the chasm to the west. Routes had been worked out from the stereo photos taken during the orbital survey. Even dark side had been covered fairly well with uniquantum film under Venus light. The Harmon-Trackman vehicle was well out of sight when Mardigan and Aiello started out on one of the bright side routes, and a few minutes later, Marini set out on the other with the spacesuit technician, Mary Spur, driving. Both vehicles disappeared quickly into a valley to the northeast, between the ash cones and a 1,000-foot spine which rose just south of them. All the tractors were in good radio contact. Zeno made sure of that before he abandoned the radio watch to Rosen, suited up, and joined Hargadon at the remaining one. They climbed in, and Hargadon set it in motion. At about the same time, the first tractor came into view again, now traveling north on the farther side of the chasm. Hargadon took this as evidence that the route thus far was unchanged and kicked in highest speed. The cabin was pretty cramped, even though some of the equipment had been attached outside. The men could not expect much comfort for the next week. Hargadon was used to the trips, however. He disapproved on principle of people who complained about minor inconveniences, such as having to sleep in spacesuits. Fortunately, Zeno's interest and excitement overrode any thought he might have had about discomfort. This lasted through the time they spent doubling the vast crack in Mercury's crust, driving on a little to the north of the ship on the other side, and then turning west toward the dark hemisphere. The route was identical to that of Harmon's machine for some time, though no trace of its passage showed on the hard surface. Then Hargadon angled off toward the southwest. He had driven this run often enough to know it well even without the markers which had been set out with the seismographs. The photographic maps were also aboard. With them, even Zeno had no trouble keeping track of their progress while they remained in sunlight. However, the sun sank as they traveled west. In 2 hours, its lower rim would have been on the horizon had they been able to see the horizon. As it was, more of the sea-level lava plain was in shadow than not even near the ship, and their route now lay in semi-darkness. The light came from peaks projecting into the sunlight, from scattered skylight which was growing rapidly fainter, and from the brighter celestial objects such as Earth. Even with the tractor's lights, it was getting harder to spot crevices and seismometer markers. Zeno quickly found the fun wearing off, though his pride made him cover this fact as best he could. If Hargadon saw this, he said nothing. He set Zeno to picking up every other instrument as any partner would have, making no allowance for the work the youngster was doing for Schlossberg. This might, of course, have had the purpose of keeping the radio man too busy to think about discomfort. Or it might merely have been Hargadon's idea of normal procedure. Whatever the cause, Zeno got little chance to use the radio once they had driven into the darkness. He managed only 1 or 2 brief talks with those left at the ship. The talks might have helped his morale, since they certainly must have given the impression that nothing was going on in the ship, while at least he had something to do in the tractor. However, this state of affairs did not last. Before the vehicle was 4 hours out of sight of the Alba Rayo, a broadcast by Camille Burkett reached them. The mineralogist's voice contained at least as much professional enthusiasm as alarm, but everyone listening must have thought promptly of the dubious stability of Mercury's crust. The call was intended for her fellow geologists Mardikian and Harmon, but it interested Zeno at least as much. "Joe, Eileen, there's a column of what looks like black smoke rising over Northeast Spur. It can't be a real fire, of course. I can't see its point of origin. But if it's the convection current it seems to be, the source must be pretty hot. It's the closest thing to a genuine volcano I've seen since we arrived. It's certainly not another of those ash mounds. I should think you'd still be close enough to make it out, Joe. Can you see anything?" The reply from Mardikian's tractor was inaudible to Zeno and Hargadon, but Burkett's answer made its general tenor plain. "I hadn't thought of that. Yes, I'd say it was pretty close to the Brightside route. It wouldn't be practical for you to stop your run now to come back to see. You couldn't do much about it anyway. I could go out to have a look and then report to you. If the way back is blocked, there'll be plenty of time to work out another." Hargadon and Zeno passed questioning glances at each other during the shorter pause that followed. "I know there aren't," the voice then went on, responding to the words they could not hear. "But it's only 2 or 3 miles, I'd say. 2 to the spur, and not much farther to where I could see the other side. Enough of the way is in shade, so I could make it in suit easily enough. I can't see calling back either of the dark side tractors. Their work is just as important as the rest. Anyway, Eileen is probably out of range. She hasn't answered yet." Another pause. "That's true. Still, it would mean sacrificing that set of seismic records. No, wait. We could go out later for those, and Mel could take his own weather measures on the later trip. There's plenty of time." Pause. longer this time. You're right, of course. I just wanted to get an early look at this volcano, if it is one. We'll let the others finish their runs, and when you get back, you can check the thing from the other side yourself. If it is blocking your way, there's time to find an alternate route. We could be doing that from the maps in the meantime, just in case. Zeno looked again at his companion. Isn't that just my luck? He exclaimed. I jump at the first chance to get away from being bored to death. The minute I'm safely away, the only interesting thing of the whole operation happens back at the ship. Who asked to come on this trip? Oh, I'm not blaming anyone but myself. If I'd stayed back there, the volcano would have popped out here somewhere, or else waited until we were gone. If it is a volcano, Dr. Burkett didn't seem quite sure. No, and I'll bet a nickel she's suiting up right now to go out and see. I hope she comes back with something while we're still near enough to hear about it. Hargadon shrugged. I suppose it was also just your luck that sent you out on a dark side trip. You know the radio stuff. You knew we couldn't reach as far as this way with the radios. Didn't you think of that in advance? I didn't think of it any more than you would have. It was bad luck, but I'm not grousing about it. Let's get on with this job. Hargadon nodded with approval, and possibly with some surprise, and the tractor hummed on its way. The darkness deepened around the patches of lava shown by the driving lights. The sky darkened toward a midnight hue, with stars showing ever brighter through it, and radio reception from the Albareo began to get spotty. Gas density at the ion layer was high enough so that recombination of molecules with their radiation-freed electrons was rapid. Only occasional streamers of ionized gas reached far over dark side. As these thinned out, so did radio reception. Camille Burkett's next broadcast came through very poorly. There was enough in it, however, to seize the attention of the two men in the tractor. She was saying, Real, all right, and dangerous. It's the thing I ever saw. Kinds of lava from what look like same vent. There's high viscosity stuff building a spatter cone to end all spatter cones, and some very thin fluid from somewhere at the bottom. The flow has already blocked the valley used by the Brightside routes and is coming along it. A new return route will have to be found for the tractors that was spreading fast when I saw it. I can't tell how much will come, but unless it stops, there's nothing at all to keep the flow away from the ship. It isn't coming fast, but it's coming. I'd advise all tractors to turn back. Captain Rosen reminds me that only one takeoff is possible. If we leave this site, we're committed to leaving Mercury. Arnie and Ren, do you hear me? Zeno responded at once. We got most of it, Doctor. Do you really think the ship is in danger? I don't know. I can only say that if this flow continues, the ship will have to leave because this area will sooner or later be covered. I can't guess how likely. Check further to get some sort of estimate. It's different from any earthly lava source, maybe you heard. Should try to get Eileen and Eric back too. I can't raise them. I suppose they're well out from under the ion layer by now. Maybe you're close enough to them to catch them with diffracted waves. Try, anyway. Whether you can raise them or not, you'd better start back yourself. Hargadon cut in at this point. What does Dr. Mardikian say about that? We still have most of the seismometers on this route to visit. I think Captain Rosen has the deciding word here, but if it helps your decision, Dr. Mardikian has already started back. He hasn't finished his route either. So hop back here, Ren. And Arnie, put that technical skill you haven't had to use yet to work raising Eileen and Eric. What I can do, I will, replied Zeno. But you'd better tape a recall message and keep it going out on, let's see, band F. All right. I'll be ready to check the volcano as soon as you get back. How long? 7 hours? Maybe 6.5? Replied Hargadon. We have to be careful. Very well. Stay outside when you arrive. I'll want to go right out in the tractor to get a closer look. She cut off. And that came through clearly enough, remarked Hargadon as he swung the tractor around. I've been awake for 14 hours, driving off and on for 10 of them. I'm about to drive for another 6, and then I'm to stand by for more. Would you like me to do some of the driving? Asked Zeno. I guess you'll have to, whether I like it or not, was the rather lukewarm reply. I'll keep on for a while, though, until we're back in better light. You get at your radio job. Part 3. Zeno tried. Hour after hour he juggled from one band to another. Once he had Hargadon stop while he went out to attach a makeshift antenna which, he hoped, would change his output from broadcast to some sort of beam. After this he kept probing the sky with the beam, first listening to the Alba Rayos broadcast in an effort to find projecting wisps of ionosphere, and then, whenever he thought he had one, switching on his transmitter and driving his own message at it. Not once did he complain about lack of equipment or remark how much better he could do once he was back at the ship. Hargadon's silence began to carry an undercurrent of approval, not usual in people who spent much time with Zeno. The technician made no further reference to the suggestion of switching drivers. They came in sight of the Alba Rayo and doubled the chasm with Hargadon still at the wheel, Zeno still at his radio, and both of them still uncertain whether any of the calls had gotten through. Both had to admit, even before they could see the ship, that Burkett had a right to be impressed. The smoke column showed starkly against the sky, blowing back over the tractor and blocking the sunlight which would otherwise have glared into the driver's eyes. Fine particles fell from it in a steady shower. Looking back, the men could see tracks left by their vehicle in the deposit which had already fallen. As they approached the ship, the dark pillar grew denser and narrower, while the particles raining from it became coarser. In some places, the ash was drifting into fairly deep piles, giving Hargadon some anxiety about possible concealed cracks. The last part of the trip, along the edge of the great chasm and around its end, was really dangerous. Cracks running from its sides were definitely spreading. The two men reached the Alba Rayo later than Hargadon had promised, and found Burkett waiting impatiently with a pile of apparatus beside her. She didn't wait for them to get out before starting to organize. There isn't much here. We'll take off just enough of what you're carrying to make room for this. No, wait. I'll have to check some of your equipment. I'm going to need one of Milt Schlossberg's gadgets, I think, so leave that on. We'll take... Excuse me, Doctor, cut in Hargadon. Our suits need servicing, or at least mine will if you want me to drive you. Perhaps Arnie could help you load for a while, if you don't think it's too important for him to get at the radio. Of course. Excuse me. I should have had someone out here to help me with this. You two go on in. Ren, please get back as soon as you can. I can do the work here. None of the stuff is very heavy. Zeno hesitated as he swung out of the cab. True, there wasn't too much to be moved, and it wasn't very heavy in Mercury's gravity, and he really should be at the radio. But the 39-year-old mineralogist was a middle-aged lady by his standards, and shouldn't be allowed to carry heavy packages. Get along, Arnie, the middle-aged lady interrupted this train of thought. Eric and Eileen are getting farther away and harder to reach every second you dawdle. He got, though he couldn't help looking northeast as he went rather than where he was going. The towering menace in that direction would have claimed anyone's attention. The pillar of sable ash was rising straighter, as though the wind were having less effect on it. An equally black cone had risen into sight beyond Northeast Spur, a cone that must have grown to some 2,000 feet in roughly 10 hours. It had far steeper sides than the cinder mounds near it. It couldn't be made of the same loose ash. Perhaps it consisted of half-melted particles which were fusing together as they fell. That might be what Burkett had meant by spatter cone. Still, if that were the case, the material fountaining from the cone's top should be lighting the plane with its incandescence, rather than casting an inky shadow for its entire height. Well, that was a problem for the geologists. Zeno climbed aboard and settled to his task. The trouble was that he could do very little more here than he could in the tractor. He could have improvised longer-wave transmitting coils whose radiations would have diffracted a little more effectively beyond the horizon, but the receiver on the missing vehicle would not have detected them. He had more power at his disposal, but could only beam it into empty space with his better antennae. He had better equipment for locating any projecting wisps of charged gas which might reflect his waves, but he was already located under a solid roof of the stuff. The alba rail was technically on bright side. Bouncing his beam from this layer still didn't give him the range he needed, as he had found both by calculation and trial. What he really needed was a relay satellite. The target was simply too far around Mercury's sharp curve by now for anything less. Zeno's final gesture was to set his transmission beam on the lowest frequency the tractor would pick up, aim it as close to the vehicle's direction as he could calculate from map and itinerary, and set the recorded return message going. He told Rosen as much. "Can't think of anything else?" the captain asked. "Well, neither can I, but of course it's not my field. I'd give a year's pay if I could. How long before they should be back in range?" "About 4 days. 100 hours, give or take a few. They'll be heading back anyway by that time." "Of course. Well, keep trying." "I am, or rather the equipment is. I don't see what else I can do unless a really bright idea should suddenly sprout. Is there anywhere else I could be useful? I'm as likely to have ideas working as just sitting." "We can keep you busy, all right. But how about taking a transmitter up one of those mountains? That would get your wave farther." "Not as far as it's going already. I'm bouncing it off the ion layer, which is higher than any mountain we've seen on Mercury, even if it's nowhere near as high as Earth's." All right. I could help Wren and Dr. Burkett. I could hang on outside the tractor." "They've already gone. You'd better call them, though, and keep a log of what they do." "All right." Zeno turned back to his board, and with no trouble raised the tractor carrying Hargadon and the mineralogist. The latter had been trying to call the Alba Rayo and had some acid comments about radio operators who slept on the job. "There's only one of me, and I've been trying to get the dark side team," he pointed out. "Have you found anything new about this lava flood?" "Flow, not flood," corrected the professional automatically. "We're not inside of it yet. We've just rounded the corner that takes us out of your sight. It's over a mile yet, and a couple more corners before we get to the spot where I left it. Of course, it'll be closer than that by now. It was spreading at perhaps 100 yards an hour then. That's one figure we must refine. Of course, I'll try to get samples too. I wish there were some way to get samples of the central cone. The whole thing is the queerest volcano I've ever heard of. Have you gotten Eileen started back?" "Not as far as I can tell. As with your cone samples, there are practical difficulties," replied Zeno. "I haven't quit yet, though." "I should think not. If some of us were paid by the idea, we'd be pretty poor, but the perspiration part of genius is open to all of us." "You mean I should charge a bonus for getting this call through?" retorted the operator. Whatever Burkett's reply to this might have been was never learned. Her attention was diverted at that point. "We're just coming inside of the flow. It's about 500 yards ahead. We'll get as close as seems safe, and I'll try to make sure whether it's really lava or just mud." "Mud? Is that possible? I thought there couldn't be any water on this planet." "It is, and there probably isn't. The liquid phase of mud doesn't have to be water, even though it usually is on Earth. Here, for example, it might conceivably be sulfur. But if it's just mud, it wouldn't hurt the ship, would it?" "Probably not." "Then why all this fuss about getting the tractors back in a hurry?" The voice which answered reminded him of another lady in his past who had kept him after school for drawing pictures in math class. "Because in my judgment, the flow is far more likely to be lava than mud, and if I must be wrong, I'd rather be my error was one that left us alive. I have no time at the moment to explain the basis of my judgment. I will be reporting our activities quite steadily from now on, and would prefer that you not interrupt unless a serious emergency demands it, or you get a call from Eileen." We're about 300 yards away now. The front is moving about as fast as before, which suggests that the flow is coming only along this valley. It's only 3 or 4 feet high, so viscosity is very low or density very high. Probably the former, considering where we are. It's as black as the smoke column. Not glowing? Cut in Zeno thoughtlessly. Black, I said. Temperature will be easier to measure when we get closer. The front is nearly straight across the valley, with just a few lobes projecting 10 or 12 yards, and one notch where a small spine is being surrounded. By the way, I trust you're taping all this. Again, Zeno was reminded of the afternoon after school. Yes, ma'am, he replied, on my one and only monitor tape. Very well. We're stopping near the middle of the valley, 100 yards from the front. I'm getting out and will walk as close as I can with a sampler and a radiometer. I assume that the radio equipment will continue to relay my suit broadcast back to you. Zeno cringed a little, certain as he was that the tractor's electronic apparatus was in perfect order. It struck him that Dr. Burkett was being more snappish than usual. It never crossed his mind that the woman might be afraid. Wren, don't get any closer with the tractor unless I call. I'll get a set of temperature readings as soon as I'm close enough. Then I'll try to get a sample. Then I'll come back with that to the tractor, leave it in the radiometer, and get the markers to set out. Couldn't I be putting out the markers while you get the sample, Doctor? You could, but I'd rather you stayed at the wheel. Hargadon made no answer, and Burkett resumed her description for the record. I'm walking toward the front, a good deal faster than it's flowing toward me. I'm now about 20 yards away, and I'm going to take a set of radiation temperature measures. A brief pause. Readings coming. 960, 980, 990. That's from the bottom edge near the spine that's being surrounded. 985. The voice droned on until about 24 readings had been taped. Then, I'm going closer now. The sampler is just a ladle on a 12-foot handle we improvised, so I'll have to get that close. The stuff is moving slowly. There should be no trouble. I'm in reach now. The lava is very liquid. There's no trouble getting the sampler in, or out again. It's not very dense either. I'm heading back toward the tractor now. No, Wren, don't come to meet me. There was a minute of silence while Zeno pictured the spacesuited figure with its awkwardly long burden, walking away from the creeping menace to the relative safety of the tractor. It's frozen solid already. We needn't worry about spilling. The temperature is about 580. Give me the markers, please. Another pause, shorter this time. Zeno wondered how much of that could be laid to a faster walk without the ladle, and how much to the lessening distance between flow and tractor. I'm tossing the first marker close to the edge. It's landed less than a foot from the lava. They're all on a light cord at 10-foot intervals. I'm paying out the cord as I go back to the tractor. Now we'll stand by and time the arrival of each marker as well as we can. How close are you to the main cone? Asked Zeno. Not close enough to see its base, I'm afraid, or to get a sample of it, which is worse. Goodness, what was that? Zeno had just enough time to ask, what was what? When he found out. 4. For a moment, he thought that the albareo had been flung bodily into the air. Then he decided the great metal pillar had merely fallen over. Finally, he realized the ship was still erect, but the ground underneath it had just tried to leave. Everyone in the group had become so used to the almost perpetual ground tremors that they had ceased to notice them, but this one demanded attention. Rosen, using language which suggested that his career may not have been completely free of adventure after all, flashed through the communication level on his way down to the power section. Schlossberg and Babineau followed, the medic pausing to ask Zeno if he were all right. The radio man nearly nodded affirmatively. His attention was already back at his job. Burkett was speaking a good deal faster than before. Never mind if the sample isn't lashed tight yet. If it falls off, there'll be plenty more. There isn't time. Arnie, Get in touch with Dr. Mardikian and Dr. Marini. Tell them that this volcano is explosive, that all estimates of what the flow may do are off until we can make more measures, and in any case, the whole situation is unpredictable. Everyone should get back as soon as possible. Remember, we decided that those big craters Eileen checked on were not meteor pits. I don't know whether this thing will let go in the next hour, the next year, or at all. Maybe what's happening now will act as a safety valve. But let's get out. Ren, that flow is speeding up and getting higher, and the ash rain is getting a lot worse. Can you see to drive? She fell silent. Zeno, in spite of her orders, left his set long enough to leap to the nearest port for a look at the volcano. He never regretted it. Across the riven plain, whose cracks were now nearly hidden under the new ash, the black cone towered above the nearer elevations. It was visibly taller than it had been only a few hours before. The fountain from its top was thicker, now jetting straight up as though wind no longer meant a thing to the fiercely driven column of gas and dust. The darkness was not so complete. Patches of red and yellow incandescence showed briefly in the pillar, and glowing sparks rather than black cinders rained back on the steep slopes. Far above, a ring of smoke rolled and spread about the column, forming an ever-broadening blanket of opaque cloud above a landscape which had never before been shaded from the sun. Streamers of lightning leaped between cloud and pillar and mountain, even cloud and ground. Any thunder there might have been was drowned in the howl of the escaping gas, a roar which seemed to combine every possible note from the shrillest possible whistle to a bass felt by the chest rather than heard by the ears. Rossen's language had become inaudible almost before he disappeared down the hatch. For long moments the radio man watched the spreading cloud and wondered whether the Albareo could escape being struck by the flickering, ceaseless lightning. Far above the widening ring of cloud, the smoke fountain drove, spreading slowly in the thinning atmosphere and beyond it. Zeno had had enough space experience to tell at a glance whether a smoke or dust cloud was in air or not. This wasn't, at least not at the upper extremity. And then, quite calmly, he turned back to his desk, aimed the antenna straight up, and called Eileen Harmon. She answered promptly. The stratigrapher listened without interruption to his report and the order to return. She conferred briefly with her companion, replied, "We'll be back in 12 hours," and signed off. And that was that. Zeno settled back with a sigh and wondered whether it would be tactful to remind Rosen of his offer of a year's pay. All 4 vehicles were now homeward bound. All one had to worry about was whether any of them would make it. Hargadon and Burkett were fighting their way through an ever-increasing ash rain a scant 2 miles away. Ash which not only cut visibility, but threatened to block the way with drifts too deep to negotiate. The wind, now blowing fiercely toward the volcano, blasted the gritty stuff against their front window as though it would erode through. And the lava flow, moving far faster than the gentle ooze they had never quite measured, surged and glowed grimly behind. 100 miles or more to the east, the tractors containing Mardikian, Marini, and their drivers headed southwest along the alternate route their maps had suggested. But Mardikian, some 3 hours in the lead, reported that he could see 4 other smoke columns in that general direction. Mercury seemed to be entering a new phase. The maps might well be out of date. Harmon and Trackman were having no trouble at the moment, but they would have to pass the Great Chasm. This had been shooting out daughter cracks when Zeno and Hargadon passed it hours before. No one could say what it might be like now, and no one was going out to make sure. "We can see you," Burkett's voice came through suddenly. "Half a mile to go, and we're way ahead of the flow." "But it's coming?" Rosen asked tensely. He had returned from the power level at Zeno's phoned report of success. "It's coming." "How fast? When will it get here? Do you know whether the ship can stand contact with it?" "I don't know the speed exactly. There may be 2 hours, maybe 5 or 6. The ship can't take it. Even the temperature measures I got were above the softening point of the alloys, and it's hotter and much deeper now. Anyway, if the others aren't back before the flow reaches the ship, they won't get through. The tractor wheels would char away, and I doubt that the bodies would float. You certainly can't wade through the stuff in a spacesuit either. And you think there can't be more than 5 or 6 hours before the flow arrives. I'd say that was a very optimistic guess. I'll stop and get a better speed estimate if you want, but won't swear to it. Rosen thought for a minute. No, he said finally. Don't bother. Get back here as soon as you can. We need the tractor and human muscles more than we need even expert guesses. He turned to the operator. Zeno, tell all the tractors there'll be no answer from the ship for a while because no one will be aboard. Then suit up and come outside. He was gone. 10 minutes later, 6 human beings and a tractor were assembled in the flame-lit near darkness outside the ship. The cloud had spread to the horizon, and the sun was gone. Burkett and Hargadon had arrived, but Rosen wasted no time on congratulations. We have work to do. It will be easy enough to keep the lava from the ship, since there seems to be a foot or more of ash on the ground, and a touch of main drive would push it into a ring wall around us. But that's not the main problem. We have to keep it from reaching the chasm anywhere south of us, since that's the way the others will be coming. If they're cut off, they're dead. It'll be brute work. We'll use the tractor any way we can think of. Unfortunately, it has no plow attachment, and I can't think of anything aboard that could be turned into one. You have shovels, such as they are. The ash is light, especially here, but there's 1.5 miles of dam to be built. I don't see how it could possibly be done, but it's going to be. Come on, Arnie, you're young and strong, came the voice of the mineralogist. You should be able to lift as much of this stuff as I can. I understand you were lucky enough to get hold of Eileen. Have you asked for the bonus yet? But your work isn't done. It wasn't luck, Zeno retorted. Burkett, in spite of her voice, seemed much less of a schoolmistress when encased in a spacesuit and carrying a shovel, so he was able to talk back to her. I was simply alert enough to make use of existing conditions, which I had to observe for myself in spite of all the scientists around. I'm charging the achievement to my regular salary. I saw... He stopped suddenly, both with tongue and shovel. Then, Captain. What is it? The only reason we're starting this wall here is to keep well ahead of the flow so we can work as long as possible, isn't it? Yes, I suppose so. I never thought of trying anywhere else. The valley would mean a much shorter dam, but if the flow isn't through it by now, it would be before we could get there. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, sir. You can put the main switch anywhere in a DC circuit. Where are the seismology stores we never had to use? 4 minutes later, the tractor set out from the Albareo, carrying Rosen and Zeno. 6 minutes after that, it stopped at the base of the ash cone which formed the north side of the valley from which the lava was coming. They parked a quarter of the way around the cone's base from the emerging flood and started to climb on foot, both carrying burdens. 47 minutes later, they returned empty-handed to the vehicle to find that it had been engulfed by the spreading liquid. With noticeable haste, they floundered through the loose ash a few yards above the base until they had outdistanced the glowing menace, descended, and started back across the plain to where they knew the ship to be, though she was invisible through the falling detritus. Once they had to detour around a crack. Once they encountered one which widened toward the chasm on their right, and they knew a detour would be impossible. Leaping it seemed impossible too, but they did it. 30 seconds after this, 40 minutes after finding the tractor destroyed, the landscape was bathed in a magnesium-white glare as the 2 1.5 kiloton charges planted just inside the crater rim let go. Should we go back and see if it worked? Asked Zeno. What's the use? The only other charges we had were in the tractor. Thank goodness they were nuclear instead of HE. If it didn't work, we'd have more trouble to get back than we're having now. If it didn't work, is there any point in going back? Stop quibbling and keep walking. Dr. Burkett, are you listening? Yes, Captain. We're fresh out of tractors, but if you want to try it on foot, you might start a set of flow measures on the lava. Arnie wants to know whether our landslide slid properly. However, the two were able to tell for themselves before getting back to the Albareo. The flow didn't stop all at once, of course, but with the valley feeding it blocked off by a pile of volcanic ash 400 feet high on one side, nearly 50 on the other, and more than a quarter of a mile long, its enthusiasm quickly subsided. It was thin, fluid stuff, as Burkett had noted, but as it spread, it cooled, and as it cooled, it thickened. 6 hours after the blast, it had stopped with its nearest lobe almost a mile from the ship, less than 2 feet thick at the edge. When Mardikian's tractor arrived, Burkett was happily trying to analyze samples of the flow, and less happily speculating on how long it would be before the entire area would be blown off the planet. When Marini and Harmon's vehicles arrived almost together, the specimens had been loaded and everything stowed for acceleration. 60 seconds after the last person was aboard, the Albareo left Mercury's surface at 2 gravities. The haste, it turned out, wasn't really necessary. She had been in parking orbit nearly 45 hours before the first of the giant volcanoes reached its climax, and the one beside their former site was not the first. It was the fourth. And that seems to be that, said Camille Burkett rather tritely as they drifted 100 miles above the little world's surface. Just a belt of white-hot calderas all around the planet. Pretty, if you like symmetry. I like being able to see it from this distance, replied Zeno, floating weightless beside her. By the way, how much bonus should I ask for getting the idea of putting the seismic charges to use after all? I wouldn't mention it. Any one of us might have thought of that. We all knew about them. Anyone might have. Let's speculate on how long it would have been before anyone did. It's still not like the other idea, which involved your own specialty. I still don't see what made you suppose that the gas pillar from the volcano would be heavily charged enough to reflect your radio beam. How did that idea strike you? Zeno thought back and smiled a little as the picture of lightning blazing around pillar, cloud, and mountain rose before his eyes. You're not quite right, he said. I was worried about it for a while, but it didn't actually strike me. It fell rather flat. Camille Burkett, Ph.D., had to have it explained to her. End of Hot Planet by Hal Clement. Read by Paul Hampton.
The Flight of the Eagle by Saul Galaxan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Shoesmith. The Flight of the Eagle by Saul Galaxan. It was a new and mysterious plant. It could make its own weather. It was sentient, and it prospered on Venus, but Earth needed it desperately, and Bat Kendo, the radar mutant, was told to bring it in. Humans are a strange breed, forgetful. They grow accustomed to the wonders they live among so easily that they never really figure up the cost. A little time passes, and the bright memories tarnish and are covered over with newer ones. And the men who picked up the check and may be paid with their lives? Forgotten. For example, when you're sitting comfortably in the New York to San Francisco Stratojet, and you take the trouble to look down at the lush verdure of the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, do you ever remember that a few short years back, that lovely fertile parkland was a rocky, barren waste? Or when you taste the delicious tropical fruits that are brought to your table from the Mojave Basin, do you think of Bat Kendo, the man who made that all possible? Like fun you do. I'll give you 10 to 1 you never heard of Bat Kendo. Maybe you don't even know that the reason those once sterile wastelands are now the larders of the North American continent is weather plant. And I'll give 8 to 5. You don't even know where that weather plant came from, or how it got here, or what it cost. Not in money, in lives. Well, I know. And for once, I'd like to have someone stand still long enough so I could tell the story. The minute anyone sees an old spaceman like me coming, they jet the hell out of there fast. Old Captain Morley's got another shaggy dog to comb out, they say, and beat it. My stories, it seems, are too old-fashioned for this modern age. Just because I, and a lot of others like me, only maybe not so lucky, spent our lives opening up the spaceways instead of sitting home on our Venturis. We're odd characters and old space hacks, and our stories are tall tales, yarns to be avoided or laughed at if it's not possible to avoid them. Okay, I expect that. But I still want to tell how that weather plant came to be where it is now, and what Bat Kendo had to do with it. He was my shipmate on the RS Eagle, and I think he's got a little credit coming to him. The history books will tell you that during the last few years of the 20th century, the population of North America increased by something like 600%. They might even tell you that this put such a load on the continental resources, food mainly, that famine became a possibility for the first time in the history of the continent. Things were pretty tight. People were actually starving amid the technological wonders of the time. Hydroponics were tried, but they fizzled badly. The only answer seemed to be complete utilization of all available land area for food production. And that meant a lot of land that couldn't grow weeds had to produce edible crops. That's the way things stood back in '02, just after the William Robert Holcomb Foundation's RS Explorer returned from Venus with what the botanists thought might be an answer. Of course, the Earth-Luna system was well-traveled even then, but it took the big money of the Holcomb Foundation, plus a whopping world federal government grant, to make a deep space mission feasible. It was a Holcomb Foundation metallurgist synthesis of impervium that made deep space navigable. Before this time, all ships were chemical-fueled, because the weight of lead needed to shield atomics would nail any spacer built to terra firma. But good. Chemical ships could make Luna, but no farther. Lucky to get that far with the pumps feeding the jets a stream of monoatomic hydrogen as thick as your arm. A ship could carry about enough juice to get up the necessary 7 a second, with maybe enough for landing. Maybe. Even then, plenty of ships that carried a pound or two of mass too much arced back to Earth and splashed themselves all over the ground. Others got up escape velocity only to run dry trying to land on Luna. Their metal bones are still up there, if you care to look for them. Impervium changed all that. Here was a metal that was easily worked, as light as a good quality aluminum-magnesium alloy, and strong as steel. And it was impervious to everything except neutrino bombardment. That was the ticket to deep space. Atomics were in and chemicals out. I might add that none of us were sorry to see him go, either. Luna remained the jumping-off place, and Foy City was the staging area for trips to up. Before the successful flight of the Explorer, Foy had been just a combination mining and scientific camp. After the Explorer returned from Venus, spacemen began to pour up from Earth, and Foy City became one of the rowdiest places under Sol. Jetmen and pilots, tube men and ABs, all the restless flotsam of humanity flowed up to Luna in a steady stream to mingle with the miners from the diggings and the long hairs from the Cosmere labs and the big dome of Starview. Mars was reached and colonization began, and men set up a settlement on Venus. The Holcomb Foundation was convinced that they had the answer to the critical food shortage on Earth. Weather plant. The one useful thing that stinking Venus produces. Weather plant is a moss-like plant that will grow almost anywhere. The Foundation botanists found that it gathered nitrogen and water in some inexplicable way, and they became interested in its possibilities. Something had to be done about soil reclamation back on Earth, or starvation would strangle the race. Weather plant looked like the answer. What the smart boys couldn't have guessed was that in addition to its other strange properties, weather plant was intelligent, sentient at least, and they didn't know that it liked its wet, foggy environment very, very much. I hit Foy City with a mammoth thirst and very little spending money. A bad combination. I had a pilot's rating and a brand new second officer's ticket, and I needed a job. I'd been handling a regular chemical flight out of Foy to Montevideo for a one-horse concern that was still trying to make the low-grade uranium ore found on the moon pay off. When I came down onto the great pumice plain of Mare Imbrium that served Foy as a spaceport, the patched-up blowtorch I was jockeying blew a venturi and buried herself under 20 feet of pumice. If it had happened on Earth, we'd have been cooked, but Luna's 1/6 gravity saved our hides. Those were the days before tractor-presser beam landings, you see. Back then, you landed a can by balancing her on her tail flare like a ball on a waterspout. And that was a rough go any way you want to look at it. Anyway, after the pile-up, I quit. There was some difference of opinion on that particular point between the company and me. They claimed I was fired. Quit or fired, however, I didn't get paid, and that led me to seek solace in the local pubs. That in turn led me to the city drunk tank for the night, and that's where I ran into Bat Kendo. Bat was chief tube man on the RS Eagle. He was also a mutation. Not that he wasn't human or anything like that, and he certainly wasn't the much kicked around Homo superior. He merely had an extra sense. We all have it dormant. Bat had it well developed. That's why he was called Bat. People thought he could see in the dark. It wasn't that. Try closing your eyes and moving your head slowly toward an obstruction. If you're very careful and very alert, you'll be able to sense the obstruction before you touch it. Well, Bat could see things that way. Perfectly. He even used to pick up beer money by getting into the ring blindfolded and letting pugs throw punches at him. They hit him, but not often. And when they did connect, it wasn't because he didn't sense the blows coming. It was because he was slow on his feet and generally 3/4 drunk. Bat's father, Nakano Kendo, had grown up in Nagasaki. He'd been exposed to radiation by the second atom blast there. Bat had befuddled the geneticists by showing up a mutation 1 generation before he was supposed to. He used to laugh about that. His mother had been Russian. Certainly you couldn't tell his nationality by looking at him. His face held a suggestion of the Asiatic, but trying to place him anthropologically would have been as difficult as finding a pure Anglo-Saxon, whatever that is. Bat was just the product of an insane age, a child of a man whose germplasm had been dosed with radiation. But for all that, Bat Kendo was normal. 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes. Only his built-in radar marked him as different. That and his terrific taste for booze. I never saw him sober. Yet to see him, you'd never guess he was perpetually saturated. There may have been bigger drunks in space, but I never knew one. As a tube man, he never had an equal. As an all-around right guy, he never will have. It was Bat that talked me into signing on the Eagle. They needed a pilot, and where a better place to find one than in the Foy City drunk tank? I knew the Eagle, of course. Everyone in the Luna-Earth system did. She was a 500-tonner, newly converted to atomics and fitting in the Foundation yards for a flight to Venusberg. She was going to pick up a full cargo of weather plant from the settlement. 100 tons of it, and brother, that's a lot of weather plant. This was to be the first quantity shipment of the stuff, the pilot shipment. The botanists suspected a lot and had great hopes, but it was up to the Eagle to get the stuff to Earth. She was the only ship available for the trip with enough storage space for the plant, and when I listened to Bat talk about it, the flight began to take on the aspect of a mercy mission. I knew people were going hungry back Earthside, and old Bat was really steamed up about it. I dare say if it hadn't been for his pep talk, I'd never have signed on. Deep space was still new, and I liked living. But Bat talked me into it, and as soon as the turnkey shook us out of the sack and shooed us out, Bat and I headed for the Foundation yards and the Eagle. My first view of the ship didn't do much to make me happy about the trip. She looked old and scabrous, standing tall on her tail fins, out on the flat, glaring plain of Mare Imbrium. Her hull was meteor-scarred and eroded by atmospheric friction, and there seemed to be an abundance of patch welds on her. Her tubes, however, were spanking brand new, and after I had inspected her control tube pile system, as all prospective pilots have a right to do, in company with Bat and Captain Reynard, I signed. Reynard was a decent enough skipper. He wasn't much of a disciplinarian, but the boat only carried a crew of 20, so that was no problem. As an astrogator, he had quite a reputation, and he'd been out to Venus before on one of the ships that lugged the settlers and scientific personnel out there. There wasn't much fanfare when the time came for our departure. Ships were lifting every day from Mars just then, and the departure of one for Venus didn't seem important. Before we left, though, a Holcomb Foundation man came aboard and spoke to us about the importance of our trip. He said that if we didn't bring back the weather plant in good shape, things might turn nasty on Earth. It would be another 1.5 years before Venus and Earth came into conjunction again, and by that time it might be too late for the thousands who were going hungry back home. Gave us a sense of responsibility, all right, and it particularly had an effect on Bat. We lifted from Mare Imbrium on 11/9/02 Earth date. I recall that I gave her 2G, easing her up to 6G and holding that acceleration for 60 hours. By that time, our speed in miles per hour wouldn't have made sense. I reveled in the power under my hands and the feeling that I could actually waste an erg or two without having to worry myself bald about landing. The Eagle carried 50 pounds of ingot thorium as fuel, and with our new atomics, that would have taken us to Centaurus if we'd had the time. It was wonderful to be able to keep the boat under a steady 1G all the way to turnover, instead of having to endure the endless nausea of freefall. Even seasoned spacemen never got used to freefall, and atomics eliminated it, thank God. The sunward flight was something to remember for sheer beauty. Earth and Luna faded astern until they were just a bright point of light. The sun blazed like a ball of white fire ahead of us, and Venus grew brighter and brighter against the breathtaking backdrop of the Milky Way. It was a gorgeous sight, but frightening too. I had the feeling that I was terribly exposed, as though I were standing balanced atop the spire of the Holcomb Tower, 500 stories above the teeming streets of New York. Agoraphobia, I think the psychs call it. The others felt it too. In fact, one of the jetmen went slightly off his rocker and had to be jugged. But most of the men came through the first fear of deep space well enough, and as an astrogator, Captain Reynard was strictly 100%. I didn't see much of Bat on the trip, since he was down in the heavily sheathed tube room with his black gang, but I could tell whenever he was on watch, because if I turned the interphone on without warning, I could almost invariably hear his beery baritone singing the praises of that Lulu, belle of Old Foy City, who wears 2 hammocks. Bat was something of a poet in his lighter moments, though most of his stuff was lamentably unprintable. I did get in on one little session with him and about a dozen of the crew. That was down in the forecastle, where he was entertaining the off-watches by letting them blindfold him and then try to hide a bottle of the tetrant alky we called our rations. Naturally, he always found it, and naturally he always drank it. It took them most of the sunward trip to wise up to the fact that he was a mutation with his own detecting system already built in, courtesy of the Manhattan Project and Nakano Kendo's irradiated gametes. The crew lost most of its alky rations that way, and old Bat soaked the stuff up like a sponge. We passed turnover point, and then the long fall down to Venus began, 3 weeks of it. Contact was established with the settlement while we were still above the stratosphere, and our ultra-wave radar went into action, the endless scanning that is absolutely essential to the landing of spacecraft through cloud layers. I don't mind admitting that there was a cold sweat on my brow when I started down through the soup. The reports from UVR indicated plenty of clearance from the mountains, but I was still leery. Some of those peaks are reported to be as high as 200,000 feet. The Eagle's gyros were screaming, and the muffled thunder of the jets filtered through every plate of her. I'd let her slide a bit, and then snatch her up with a blast of the jets. Each time I touched the firing consoles, I could hear the moan of the blasted atomic particles rushing through the Venturis, and I could see the glitter of the cloud moisture that hugged the ports as it absorbed lethal radiations from the tail flare. Then the clouds began to thin, and I could make out the pattern of the spaceport beneath us through the billowing formaldehyde mists that serve Venus for an atmosphere. I was a wreck by the time the Eagle's fins touched the ground and the dancing fire of the tubes flickered and died. I felt her sag as she sank slightly into the mushy soil, and then I was cutting the power switches and listening to the slowly descending whine of the gyros as they coasted silkily to a halt. I looked out of the ports, at the miasmic swamp that surrounded us, at the 50-foot ferns in ghastly colors, at the alien repellent trees that grew pulpy and squat all around the settlement. This was Venus. Venusburg wasn't the great domed city then that it is now. Back in '02, it was just a group of pressurized Quonset huts. There were about 60 men there, mostly maintenance workers and horticulturalists, and 5 women. 4 women were scientists. The 5th, Bat Kendo spent his planet leave with. The settlers were very cordial with us. I guess we must have been like a breath of the home world to these poor characters who lived there. I accompanied Captain Reynard on a tour of the cultivated areas and the settlement itself. We were shown how the weather plant was cultivated and how it gathered nitrogen and water out of the fetid air to deposit it in the soil. We saw how there were always banks of mist over the rows of plants. It gave me quite a shock when I reached down to touch some, and the stuff actually shied away from my pressure suit glove. We suspect the stuff might actually be sentient, the settlement botanist told us. You mean the stuff thinks? Captain Reynard demanded. The botanist laughed. Oh, no, it's just that when there's a considerable amount of the stuff about, it reacts peculiarly. As soon as this shipload of yours gets to Earth, the Foundation staff can really get to work with it and see just what all it can do. We've great hopes for it. It may be the answer to starvation back home. I looked out over the neat rows of tiny plants that vanished in the misty distance, and I looked too at the pressing jungle. I began to get a queasy feeling in my stomach. This was alien life, life that had never been meant for Earth's clean soil. There was no telling what the stuff might do away from here. We suspect, the botanist was saying, that the high formaldehyde content of Venus's atmosphere has an inhibiting effect on the action of the plant. We've isolated small amounts in formaldehyde-free air and gotten some interesting results. Freed of its native ecology, we believe the stuff can actually create its own weather. His voice faded away as far as I was concerned. Somewhere in my head a bell was trying to ring. There was something here that was escaping this botanist and Captain Reynard. I couldn't put my finger on it. I had the crazy feeling that something, like the purloined letter, was hidden here. Something obvious, something that could be, under the proper circumstances, dangerous. But I didn't figure it out, not just then, not until it was too late. All the clues were there, the plant and the way it could gather water vapor and nitrogen, the threat of taking it from its native ecology, everything. But I didn't tumble, not until it was too late, and the obvious had taken a toll, in lives. On 23/35/02 Venus date, the Eagle was fully loaded and ready for the long haul back up to the Earth. The colonists gathered to bid us farewell, and the party was a corker. Bat did his cumin radar act somewhere along about the time the 15th libation was poured. He was at his extra-normal best, telling astounded colonists just what they were doing with their pinkies at ranges up to 300 yards in pitch darkness. I could have told him it was almost as good as UVR, but that might have spoiled the effect. 3 hours later, we had bid an enthusiastic goodbye to that mushy ball of swamp and stench those poor colonials called home, and the valves sighed shut in the Eagle's flanks. The loading cranes pulled away and our own were retracted. The ramp was cleared and the lift ship alarm blared through the Eagle. The gyros reached operating RPM and I let my hands play over the consoles. The boat shuddered and lifted, slowly, on a tail of fire. I fed her more power and the accelerometer moved up to 2G. I held her there until we broke out of the clouds and into the crystalline cobalt of the ionosphere. I swung the power lever over, and the Eagle leaped upward, her needle nose pointed for home. We were well past turnover, in fact just about 19 hours from Earth, when things began happening. Bat called control, his voice tense with excitement. "Morley, there's something coming, fast, I can feel it." I started to ask him what was coming fast, and whether or not he could see it clearly through the metal of the ship, but I never finished. UVR flashed a red alert warning on my control panel, and it was the last warning it ever gave. The panel screeched, "Meteor swarm," and went dead. The lights flickered and went out as the Eagle bucked and roared in protest. The sound of tearing metal knifed through the hull, and then the whooshing sound of escaping air. Alarm bells clattered futilely. Bulkheads slammed. The ship's self-sealing mesoderm saved most of the air, but not before the pressure in the boat dropped from 14.7 down to 6 pounds per square inch in about 2 seconds, and doubled me up in an agony of aeroembolism. For a long while there was silence, and I fought the glittering knives of pain that seemed to be cutting me into hamburger. Then the lights came back on, dimly. There was still life in the old Eagle. I staggered to my feet and rang the tube room. A pilot's first instinct is to check the power. No matter what has happened to a ship, if there's power, there's hope. "Morley!" It was Bat, calling back through the interphone. "We've had it down here. The sheathing is gone and I got 3 men killed." I could hear the sound of metal sizzling in the background as Bat looked about for more dope to pass on. As it was, it looked bad enough. If the sheathing was shot, that meant he was taking lethal doses of radiation, even as he spoke to me. "Bat!" I shouted. "Bat, you crazy fool! If that place is hot, get out of there!" I got no reply. "Bat, that's an order! Put the pile on automatic and get the hell out!" "No soap, Morley." Bat's voice seemed edged with pain. "You know the autos won't last for more than 30 minutes. Strictly emergency stuff." And then his voice grew even tighter. "The storage, Morley. Those stinking rocks took out the storage. All the thorium went out the side. They hit the storage bunker." That tore it. Without thorium, without even an extra gram, the best we could hope for was making it to Earth. Luna and its lovely 1/6 gravity for a crash landing was out. I tried to get Captain Reynard on the phone, but there was no answer from his quarters. I didn't need a diagram to figure out that he was either dead or so tied up with bends that he couldn't reach the phone. I started the compressors, and the pressure began to build up, but the mesoderm patches wouldn't stand more than 9 pounds. Well, had to do. The griping pains eased a bit inside me, and I tried to take stock of the situation. Station by station, I called the crew and assessed the damage. It was plenty. The whole communications deck was gone, and the only radio on board that worked was the tiny panel set in control. The UVR was mangled, and so was its crew of 4 men. 3 tube men had died in the tube room, and I didn't know how badly Bat might be hurt. No one could enter because the place was hot. The thorium was gone, and the sheathing on the pile too. I looked in on the captain and scratched him off the list. Death from bends is not a pleasant thing to see. The Eagle was my command now. As pilot and second officer, I took over, for better or worse. I returned to control and gave the crew a quick rundown on the situation. Work parties were made up and the wreckage cleared away. The dead, the ones we could find, were wrapped in cellophlex and consigned to space. I mumbled a prayer over them as they slipped out into the void. They weren't all Christians, but somehow I had a feeling that they wouldn't mind too much. There's something about the immensity of the cosmos that makes men relinquish their petty prejudices. And when I got back into control and watched the telltales on the Geiger-Muller counters down in the tube room, I said another prayer for Bat Kendo. I kept wondering why we had hit that meteor swarm. The normal chances of such an encounter are in the vicinity of 1,000 to 1. Bits of memory kept tugging at me, but I couldn't get things properly trimmed up until a call from Bat in the tube room furnished the key. "Morley, There's a piece of those damn rocks down here, and it's melting. Ice, water, weather plant. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit now. The swarm was ice, super hard ice, tempered by the awful cold of the void. And the weather plant in the hold, 100 tons of it, had attracted it hungrily. The plant had more than just an affinity for water. It acted like a magnet. There had probably been nitrogen dissolved in the water, too, and that had added to the plant's attraction. A sick feeling moved into the pit of my stomach and stayed right there. There was no way of jettisoning the cargo, and there wasn't enough fuel for a try at airless Luna. That meant... I could hear the Venusian botanist's words echo mockingly in my ears. We suspect it can create its own weather. I knew real fear then. I looked at the great greenish globe of Earth that grew hourly larger beneath us, and shuddered. 17 hours later we were into the ionosphere. My instruments warned that I had just enough thorium left in the pile to keep the Eagle up for another hour and 10 minutes. The radar was gone, but the weather plant was fat and healthy. I tried to pick up a good spot for the landing, the Mojave Desert. Chances for clear weather were better there than anywhere else, though I could guess even then what our chances were. The Eagle shuddered to a vibrating halt, balancing on her tail flare at about 25 miles. The gyros were climbing the sonic scale, sending their shrieking whine through every deck of the crippled ship. I looked outside, and cold sweat beaded my face. Even at this height, a fine mist was forming around the Eagle. Freed of Venus's formaldehyde atmosphere, our tons of weather plant were happily doing their job, drawing water vapor out of Earth's air. It liked fog, and it could make its own weather. I looked at the chronometer. I had just 1 hour now to get this ship down through this soup that clung to us, without UVR. I had 1 hour to do the job, or gravity would do it for me. I let her slip down to 15 miles and held there, gyros protesting. The mist thickened. I rang the crash alarm, sending all hands who were not actually engaged in the running of the ship to their quarters and the crash hammocks. My hands were icy cold. The Eagle sank slowly down to 5 miles and hung there like a ball bouncing on a jet of water. The mist billowed about us, turning radioactive from the vicious lashing of the tail flare. I knew that the weather was perfectly clear, perhaps 200 yards away from the ship, but the weather plant was creating the soggy weather it liked, and I was being effectively blindfolded by the... Blindfolded. I grabbed for the interphone. "Bat!" I yelled. "Bat! Can you see anything below?" Old Bat knew right away what I wanted, but his answer wasn't what I wanted to hear. "Too much metal under me, Morley. Too much metal." His voice was unsteady and seamed with pain. I glanced at the chronometer. 37 minutes left, and the fog clung to the ports. "Morley," Bat sounded something like himself for just a minute. "I got a notion. Maybe it'll work. Break out a pressure suit and get the craneman on the ball. And Morley," here I could imagine he was smiling, "break out a bottle of the skipper's bonded stuff, will you?" "What are you dreaming up?" I demanded anxiously. "We have to get this cargo down," Bat said thinly. "You remember what the Foundation man said before we left? People need food, Morley." "What are you thinking about?" I asked again. And then, as realization came, I added angrily, "Never mind that. I know what you're planning, Bat, and you can forget it. I'll get this can down all right." The voice from the interphone was dry as dust. "Like hell you will. Who are you kidding?" I had no answer there. Without UVR to guide me, I was blind. I didn't have a chance to get the Eagle down, and we both knew it. "I'm coming up," Bat said. "The automatics can take care of things down here now." I glanced at the chronometer. 22 minutes to go. Bat was right. The autos could carry on in the tube room now. I felt them cut into the circuit. My heart was heavy as I called a crane man into control to handle the equipment. Together we unlimbered a pressure suit from the locker. Then I found the skipper's rations and uncorked a bottle. In a moment, Bat was in control. When I saw him, my stomach muscles tightened. He looked as though he'd been broiled. His face was a swollen mass of angry flesh, and his clothes were seared into his hide. Every movement must have been sheer hell for him, but he staggered into the suit and made himself fast to the control crane. Before calling for the steel glass helmet, he reached thirstily for the skipper's bottle and took a long pull. "Ah," he breathed, "that's fine stuff, real fine." He offered me the bottle, grinning painfully. "Have one on me, Morley." I let the fiery liquor drive down the lump that was sticking in my throat, and handed Bat the bottle. He finished it in 2 swallows, looked at it regretfully, and tossed it aside. It landed in the corner of control, where it lay rocking senselessly back and forth with the jolting movements of the boat. Bat fastened his helmet on and started for the valve. I wanted to reach out and stop him, but I couldn't. I wanted to say something to him, but what? How do you thank a man for buying your life with his own? What do you say to pay a man for his pain and his torture? That's right, you don't say anything. And neither did I. You just stand there and watch, with your heart a lump of lead inside you. I did that, and no more. He turned toward me just as the inner valve closed on him and the cable he dragged behind him. "See ya," he said with a clumsy wave. And then he was outside in that radioactive mist of death, riding the crane out and down, hanging by a thin cable in that stinking fog, and using his useless mutational powers to save the hides of his ship and shipmates and the load of weather plant that meant food to the stay-at-homes. The mass ratio altimeter gave its last reading, 4 miles, and then it was through, its sensitive coils thrown out of phase by the mass of the planetary globe under us. Here, now, was where UVR should have taken over. But there was no UVR. Only a man hanging at the end of a cable in a glowing mist that was burning his last chance of life out of him. I heard his instructions clearly over the small panel set. "About 3 miles up now." I let the eagle down slowly. 2 miles. 1. Hold. 3,000 feet. 2. 1. Hold. 500 feet. Hold. Mojave Desert right under us. Baldy off to the right. Lancaster about 20 miles north. Down easy. The tail flare was splashing against the desert beneath now, turning the clinging mist into a ruddy shroud. A glance at the chronometer showed about 3 minutes fuel. "Let her down slow." Bat's voice was fading fast as the terrific heat seared him and the radiation burned deep. The fuel should be gone now. No time left. 200 feet. 100. 50. 30. I heard Bat's voice sob just once through the radio. "Oh, dear God!" And that was all. No time. No fuel. Silence. The thunder of the jets stopped abruptly, leaving a frightening void. The eagle slewed about sickeningly, and then dropped the remaining 30 feet like so much lead. There was a rending crash as her tail section crumpled, battered plates sinking into the sand, and then she settled wearily to a halt amid the bubbling magma of atomized earth. So the pilot shipment of weather plant got here all right, and it exceeded the Holcomb Foundation's fondest hopes. It brought fertility where there had been only barrenness. Long rows of it still bring richness and life to the soil, and the danger of famine is gone forever. Just remember now, the next time you take the Pacific Stratojet, look under you at that garden of plenty. See the rows upon rows of richly bearing plants. Look, too, at the interstices, where a tiny Venusian moss called weather plant makes it all possible. Bat Kendo? He died. He died doing what he wanted to do, and that's something. The others maybe weren't so lucky. Of course, you never heard of Bat, or of the eagle, for that matter. All this happened a long, long time ago, and the old memories tarnish. Now, people take their lives pretty much as they find it, and they never wonder about the guys who made it what it is. Yes, humans are a strange breed, like I say, forgetful, very forgetful. End of The Flight of the Eagle by Saul Galaxon.